The wealthiest man in Wyoming Territory stood frozen in a dusty general store, watching a woman scrub mud off her boots like she owned the world. Celia Mercer didn't bow, didn't smile politely, didn't even acknowledge Orson Hale's presence. That defiance would cost her everything: her reputation, her business, nearly her life. Their love would trigger land wars, social exile, and a drought that almost destroyed the entire valley. But before we get there, you need to understand how a laundress and a cattle baron became the most dangerous couple the frontier had ever seen. Drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and let's begin. Spring 1878 arrived in Cutter's Hollow the way it always did, with mud thick enough to swallow wagon wheels and wind that scraped your face raw. The general store smelled like tobacco, leather, and the particular kind of dust that settled into wooden floorboards and never quite left. Orson Hale pushed through the door expecting nothing more than his usual order: coffee, ammunition, maybe some decent tobacco if Henderson had managed to get a shipment through the mountain pass. Instead, he got Celia Mercer. She was sitting on an overturned crate near the back corner, one boot propped on her knee, scrubbing dried mud from the leather with a stiff brush. Her sleeves were rolled past her elbows. Her hands were red and raw from work. She didn't look up when the bell above the door chimed. Didn't glance over when Henderson called out his usual greeting to Orson. Just kept scrubbing, methodical and focused, like nothing in the world mattered except getting that boot clean. Orson had lived in Wyoming Territory for 15 years. He'd built the largest ranch within 200 miles. He employed 43 men, controlled water rights to 3 major creeks, and owned enough cattle that he'd stopped counting after the first 1,000 head. When Orson Hale walked into a room, people noticed. They straightened their backs, adjusted their hats, cleared space at the bar. This woman didn't even blink. "Orson?" Henderson was already pulling down the usual supplies. "Got your coffee in yesterday. Fresh batch. Appreciate it." Orson's voice came out rougher than intended. He was still watching the woman in the corner. She'd moved to the second boot now. Same efficient strokes, same complete indifference to everything happening around her. Henderson followed his gaze and lowered his voice. "That's Celia Mercer. Runs the boarding house on 4th Street. Does laundry for half the town." "I know who she is." That was a lie. Orson had heard the name, maybe seen her once or twice from a distance, but he'd never actually looked at her before. Never noticed the way she held herself like she had nothing to prove and nothing to lose. Never seen the small scar above her left eyebrow or the way her mouth pressed into a thin line when she concentrated. "She waitin' on something?" Orson asked. Henderson shrugged. "Her order won't be ready till Thursday. I told her that. She said she'd wait." "It's Monday." "I'm aware." Celia Mercer stood abruptly, brushed dust from her skirt with those same rough hands, and walked toward the counter. She moved past Orson like he was a piece of furniture. No acknowledgement, no polite nod. Nothing. "Henderson," she said. Her voice was lower than he expected. Steady. "I need you to look at something." She pulled a broken buckle from her coat pocket and set it on the counter. "Can you fix this, or do I need to order a new one?" Henderson picked it up, turned it over. "I can probably manage it. Give me a few days." "Thursday works." "You coming back Thursday anyway?" "That's right." Henderson made a note in his ledger. Celia turned to leave. She made it 3 steps before Orson spoke. "You always wait 3 days for supplies?" She stopped, turned slowly, looked at him directly for the first time. Her eyes were gray. Not the soft gray of morning fog, but the hard gray of river stones. The kind of gray that didn't give anything away. "You always ask strangers questions that aren't your business?" Behind the counter, Henderson made a small choking sound. Orson felt something shift in his chest. Surprise, maybe. Or irritation. Or something he couldn't quite name. Wasn't trying to pry, just seemed like a long wait for a buckle. "I've got other things to pick up Thursday. Makes sense to do it all at once." She tilted her head slightly. "You keeping track of my errands now, Mr. Hale?" So she knew who he was. That was something. "No, ma'am, just making conversation." "I'm not much for conversation." She walked out. The door swung shut behind her with a decisive click. Henderson let out a long breath. "Well, that was something." Orson stared at the closed door. "She always like that?" "Far as I know, never seen her bow and scrape to anyone. Not the mayor, not the town council, not even old Mrs. Hartley. And that woman could make a grizzly bear apologize. Henderson started wrapping Orson's coffee in brown paper. Celia keeps to herself mostly. Does good work, though, honest, fair prices, doesn't gossip. How long's she been in Cutter's Hollow? 5 years? Maybe 6. Came here after her father died. He was a blacksmith over in Cheyenne. Left her nothing but debts, from what I heard. She paid every cent, then came out here and started the boarding house. Henderson tied string around the package. Town respects her, but they don't exactly warm to her, if you know what I mean. Orson knew exactly what he meant. Celia Mercer didn't fit the mold. She wasn't soft-spoken, wasn't decorative, wasn't trying to marry her way into security or comfort. She was just doing the work, making her way, not asking permission. That should have been the end of it. Orson should have collected his supplies, ridden back to the ranch, and forgotten the entire interaction. Instead, he came back Thursday. He told himself it was coincidence. He needed nails anyway, and Henderson usually had good prices on hardware. The fact that Celia Mercer might be there had nothing to do with it, except it did. And when he walked in and saw her standing at the counter, collecting a wrapped parcel and that repaired buckle, something settled in his chest that felt dangerously close to satisfaction. "Mr. Hale." She acknowledged him this time, barely. A small nod, no warmth behind it. "Miss Mercer." Henderson glanced between them, clearly sensing something but smart enough not to comment. Celia finished her transaction, tucked the buckle into her pocket, and headed for the door. Orson followed without thinking. "Miss Mercer." She stopped on the wooden walkway outside, turned with that same measured patience. Yes, up close, in better light, he could see the weariness around her eyes. She was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 30, 32, but she carried herself with the weight of someone who'd already lived twice that long. "I wanted to apologize," he said, "for the other day. Wasn't my place to comment on your business." She studied him for a long moment. "You apologizing because you mean it, or because someone told you I'm respectable enough to warrant it?" Orson blinked. "I'm apologizing because I was rude." "Fair enough." She shifted the parcel in her arms. "Apology accepted." She started walking. Orson fell into step beside her. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You're going to anyway. Why'd you wait 3 days? Henderson said your order wasn't ready, but you could have come back any time." Celia slowed her pace slightly, not stopping, just considering. "I don't make unnecessary trips into town. Costs time and energy I don't have to waste. So I plan, I consolidate. I make one trip do the work of 3. That's smart. That's survival." They walked another half block in silence. Celia's boarding house was visible now, a 2-story structure that had seen better days but was clearly well maintained. The windows were clean, the steps had been recently repaired. "This is me," she said, stopping at the gate. Orson looked at the house, then back at her. "You run this place yourself?" "Myself and 2 girls who help with the heavy laundry. I've got 4 boarders right now, mostly ranch hands between jobs, couple of miners passing through." "That's a lot of work." "It is." She met his eyes directly. "But it's my work. Nobody can take it from me. Nobody can tell me I'm doing it wrong. And at the end of the day, I answer to myself." She paused. "That worth something to you, Mr. Hale?" He thought about his ranch, the constant negotiations, the land disputes, the pressure from other ranchers who thought he had too much power, or not enough. The endless decisions that affected 43 families who depended on his judgment. "Yeah," he said quietly. "It is." Something shifted in her expression, not quite a smile, but a softening. "Then you understand why I scrub my own boots." She went inside. Orson stood at the gate longer than he should have, staring at that closed door like it might open again if he waited. It didn't, but he came back anyway. The third time wasn't at the general store. It was a Sunday afternoon in early May, and Orson had ridden into town with no clear purpose beyond restlessness. His ranch felt too big lately, too quiet. He'd eaten breakfast alone, read the same newspaper twice, and finally saddled his horse just to have something to do. He found himself on 4th Street without planning it. Celia was in her garden, a small plot beside the boarding house where she grew vegetables and herbs. She was on her knees in the dirt, wearing an old dress and a wide-brimmed hat, transplanting seedlings with careful precision. Orson tied his horse to the fence and approached slowly. "Afternoon, Miss Mercer." She looked up, shading her eyes against the sun. "Mr. Hale? You lost?" "No, ma'am, just riding through." "You ride through 4th Street often?" "Not particularly." She sat back on her heels, studying him. "You want something?" The directness should have been off-putting. Instead, Orson found it refreshing. No games, no pretense, just straight questions expecting straight answers. "I wanted to see if you'd have coffee with me," he said. "There's a decent place on Main Street." "I know where it is." "That a yes?" Celia looked down at her dirt-covered hands, then back at him. "Why?" "Why what?" "Why do you want to have coffee with me?" Orson opened his mouth, closed it. The honest answer felt too vulnerable, but anything else would be a lie, and something told him Celia Mercer could spot a lie from 100 yards away. "Because I can't stop thinking about the way you didn't notice me in Henderson's store," he said finally. "And because when I talk to most people, I'm the richest rancher in the territory. But when I talk to you, I'm just a man asking questions he probably shouldn't." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she stood, brushed dirt from her skirt, and removed her hat. "Give me 10 minutes to wash up," she said. "And Mr. Hale?" "Yes?" "I don't drink coffee. I prefer tea." "I'll remember that." She disappeared inside. Orson waited by the fence, heart beating harder than it had any right to. 10 minutes felt like an hour. When Celia emerged, she'd changed into a simple blue dress and pinned her dark hair back. She wasn't beautiful in the conventional sense. Her features were too sharp, her expression too guarded. But there was something compelling about her, something that made you want to keep looking. They didn't go to Main Street. Instead, Celia suggested they walk to the creek on the edge of town. "Too many ears at the coffee house," she said. "People talk." "Let them." She gave him a sideways look. "Easy for you to say. You're Orson Hale. I'm the woman who washes your ranch hands' underclothes." "That bother you?" "The laundry? No. The gossip? Sometimes." They found a spot beneath a cottonwood tree where the creek widened into a shallow pool. The water moved slowly here, catching light and throwing it back in silver flashes. Celia sat on a large rock, tucking her skirts around her legs. Orson settled nearby, close enough to talk, but not so close as to crowd her. "How'd you end up in Cutter's Hollow?" he asked. "Same way most people do. I was running from something and toward something else, and this seemed like a reasonable place to stop." She picked up a small stone, turned it over in her palm. "My father died owing money to half of Cheyenne. I could have run, could have changed my name and disappeared, but that felt cowardly. So I stayed, worked off every debt, and when there was nothing left tying me there, I came here." "Why here specifically?" "Heard they needed a boarding house. Figured I could do that." She tossed the stone into the creek. "What about you? You born here?" "Missouri originally, came west when I was 19, had $12 and a rifle, worked cattle drives for 5 years, saved every cent, bought my first 100 acres in '68, built from there." That's the short version. That's the version that doesn't take 3 hours. Celia smiled, actually smiled, and Orson felt like he'd won something. "I've got time," she said. So he told her. Not the sanitized version he gave at town council meetings, but the real story. The brutal winters when he almost lost everything. The first year he made a profit and couldn't believe it was real. The slow, grinding work of building something from nothing in a place that fought you every step of the way. Celia listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You ever lonely out there?" she asked. "Big ranch, all those people working for you, but no one actually with you?" The question landed like a punch. Orson looked out at the creek, at the mountains beyond, at everything he'd built that somehow wasn't enough. "Yeah," he said. "I am. Me too." Celia's voice was soft. "The boarding house is always full, but it's still just me. Every decision, every problem, every long night when something breaks and needs fixing, it's just me." They sat in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that felt like recognition, like finding someone who spoke the same language you'd thought was private. "Can I ask you something?" Orson said eventually. "Go ahead." "Why aren't you married? Woman like you, running a business, managing property, seems like you'd have options." Celia laughed, but there wasn't much humor in it. "Options? That's generous. I've had proposals, if that's what you're asking. 3, to be exact. One from a drunk miner who thought I'd be grateful for the attention. One from a widower who needed someone to raise his 6 children. And one from a merchant who made it very clear he wanted my boarding house, not me. You turned them all down. Every one. I'd rather be alone than be someone's solution to a problem I didn't create. She looked at him directly. That make me difficult? No, it makes you honest. Most men don't appreciate honesty in a woman. Most men are fools. That got another smile, small but real. They talked until the sun started dropping toward the mountains, casting long shadows across the creek. They talked about droughts and cattle prices, about the isolation of frontier life, about books they'd read and places they'd never been. They talked like two people who'd been alone too long and had forgotten how good it felt to be understood. When Celia finally stood to leave, Orson stood with her. "Can I see you again?" he asked. She considered the question seriously. "People will talk, Mr. Hale. I don't care. You should. I'm a laundress. You're a man asking if he can see you again." Celia studied his face for a long moment. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her because she nodded. "Sunday afternoons, I'm usually in the garden. You're welcome to stop by." "I will. Don't bring flowers." "No?" "Bring seeds or cuttings. Something useful." Orson laughed, actually laughed, and it felt like the first genuine sound he'd made in months. "Yes, ma'am." He walked her back to the boarding house. Neither of them said much, but something had changed. Something had been acknowledged between them that couldn't be taken back. As Celia reached her front steps, she turned. "Mr. Hale?" "Orson, please." "Orson." She tried the name, seemed to approve. "I'm not easy to be around. I don't apologize for having opinions. I don't soften my edges to make men comfortable. And I've got no interest in being anyone's decoration or stepping stone." "Good," Orson said, "because I've got no interest in decoration or stepping stones either." "Then we understand each other." "I believe we do." She went inside. Orson rode back to his ranch with his heart beating in a way it hadn't in 15 years. He didn't know it yet, but that afternoon by the creek would change everything. For him, for Celia, for the entire valley that was about to watch them fall in love. The next Sunday, Orson arrived at 4th Street carrying a small cloth bag of tomato seeds and cuttings from his best apple tree. Celia was already in the garden, wearing the same work dress and wide-brimmed hat. She looked up when she heard the gate, and something in her expression eased. "You came," she said. "Said I would." People say lots of things. Orson handed her the bag. Celia opened it, examined the seeds and cuttings, with the careful attention of someone who knew good stock when she saw it. "These'll do well here," she said. "Thank you." "You're welcome." They worked together that afternoon. Orson didn't know much about vegetables, but he knew soil and irrigation and how to dig a decent hole. Celia directed him with the same efficiency she brought to everything else, and Orson found himself enjoying the simple physicality of the work. No complicated negotiations, no hidden agendas, just dirt and seeds and the quiet satisfaction of building something. When they finished, Celia brought out 2 glasses of water and they sat on her front steps, watching the street in companionable silence. "Can I ask you something personal?" Celia said after a while. "Depends on the question." "Why aren't you married?" Orson had expected this eventually. "Never found the right woman, I suppose." "That's the polite answer. What's the real one?" He took a long drink of water, buying time. "The real answer is that every woman who showed interest was interested in Orson Hale the rancher, not Orson Hale the man. They saw the land and the cattle and the money, and they thought that's what they wanted. But I've seen what that kind of marriage looks like. My parents had it. Cold house, separate beds, 2 people living beside each other instead of with each other." He set down his glass. "I'd rather be alone than be lonely with someone." Celia was quiet for a moment. "That's honest. You asked for real." "I did." She stood, brushed dust from her skirt. "I should start dinner. Boarders expect food at 6. "Of course." Orson stood as well. "Can I come back next Sunday?" "If you want." "I want." Something flickered across Celia's face, surprise, maybe, or pleasure, but it was gone before Orson could identify it. "Then I'll see you next Sunday." "Celia?" "Yes?" "Thank you for the afternoon." "You did most of the work." "That's not what I'm thanking you for." She understood. He could see it in the way her expression softened, just slightly. "You're welcome, Orson." He left before he could say something stupid or premature, but riding back to the ranch, he couldn't stop thinking about the way she'd said his name. Not Mr. Hale, not Sir, just Orson, plain and simple, like he was someone worth knowing instead of someone worth impressing. The Sunday visits became routine. Orson would arrive mid-afternoon with seeds or cuttings, or sometimes just his company. They'd work in the garden together, then sit and talk until the sun started setting. They talked about everything and nothing: weather patterns and water tables, difficult borders and stubborn cattle, childhood memories and half-forgotten dreams. Celia never pretended to be anything she wasn't. She didn't soften her opinions or laugh at jokes that weren't funny. When she disagreed with Orson, she said so directly. When she thought he was wrong, she told him why. It was refreshing and terrifying and completely addictive. By the third week, Orson realized he was falling for her. By the fourth week, he knew he was in serious trouble. The problem wasn't Celia. The problem was everyone else. The first hint of trouble came from his ranch foreman, Tom Brewster. They were reviewing cattle counts in Orson's office when Tom cleared his throat in that particular way that meant he had something uncomfortable to say. "Boss, can I speak freely?" Orson looked up from the ledger. "When have you not?" "It's about your visits to town." Orson's jaw tightened. "What about them?" "People are talking, saying you're courting Celia Mercer." "And if I am?" Tom shifted his weight. "She's a good woman, honest, hardworking. But she's also a laundress, Orson. The other ranchers' wives, they're already whispering, saying it's inappropriate, saying you're lowering yourself." "Those women don't run my life." "No, but they run the social calendar. And if they decide to freeze you out, it'll affect business, partnerships, water rights negotiations, all the stuff that requires goodwill and cooperation." Orson closed the ledger with more force than necessary. "So what are you suggesting? I stop seeing her to keep a bunch of gossiping wives happy?" "I'm suggesting you think about what you're risking." Tom's voice was careful. "This valley runs on relationships. You've spent 15 years building those relationships. One woman, no matter how good she is, might not be worth burning it all down." "Get out!" Tom blinked. "Boss, I said get out. And Tom, don't presume to tell me what's worth risking ever again." Tom left. Orson sat alone in his office, staring at nothing, feeling anger and fear twist together in his chest. Because Tom was right. The valley did run on relationships, and Orson could already feel those relationships shifting, cooling. The casual invitations to dinner had stopped. The friendly waves from neighboring ranchers had become curt nods. Last week, Eleanor Crowley, the influential wife of Martin Crowley, who controlled the second-largest ranch in the territory, had actually turned her back when she saw him in town. He should care. His practical mind knew that. But every time he thought about walking away from Celia, something in his chest revolted. The confrontation came 2 weeks later at the monthly Cattlemen's Association meeting. Orson arrived expecting the usual discussions about grazing boundaries and railroad negotiations. Instead, he walked into a room full of carefully neutral expressions and one very hostile Eleanor Crowley. The meeting proceeded normally for the first hour. Then, during open discussion, Eleanor stood. "I'd like to address a matter of community standards," she said, her voice carrying across the room. Orson's stomach dropped. "We pride ourselves on being a respectable settlement," Eleanor continued. "Our families have built this valley from nothing. We've established churches, schools, social structures that reflect our values. And those values include maintaining appropriate associations." She looked directly at Orson. "When someone of prominence, someone whose actions reflect on all of us, chooses to court a woman of questionable suitability, it undermines everything we've worked to build." "Careful, Eleanor." Orson's voice was quiet but dangerous. She didn't back down. "Celia Mercer is a laundress. She runs a boarding house that caters to drifters and miners. She has no family, no connections, no refinement. She is not appropriate company for a man of your station, Orson. And your continued association with her is becoming an embarrassment to this community." The room went silent. Every man there suddenly found something fascinating about the floor or the ceiling or the backs of their hands. Orson stood slowly. "You finished? I'm trying to help you see reason." "All right." "Boomissem, No. You're trying to tell me who I can care about based on some arbitrary idea of class that means nothing out here. He looked around the room, meeting eyes that quickly glanced away. Celia Mercer is twice the woman most of you have married. She built a business from nothing. She paid her father's debts when she could have walked away. She works harder than anyone in this room, including me. And if you think I'm going to stop seeing her because a bunch of small-minded hypocrites disapprove, you've severely misjudged me. Martin Crowley finally spoke. Orson, no one's saying Miss Mercer isn't hardworking, but there are practical considerations. Partnerships, social standing. Your choice affects more than just you. Then maybe those partnerships aren't worth what I thought they were. He walked out. Behind him, the room erupted in urgent whispers. Orson rode straight to 4th Street. Celia was hanging laundry when he arrived, wooden clothespins held between her teeth as she stretched a sheet across the line. She saw his expression and immediately set down the basket. What happened? Orson dismounted, tied his horse with hands that shook slightly from lingering anger. Eleanor Crowley just told the entire Cattlemen's Association that you're beneath me. Celia's face went carefully blank. I see. She said you're inappropriate, that I'm embarrassing the community by courting you. And what did you say? I told her to go to hell. Not in those words exactly, but the meaning was clear. Celia was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was steady but strained. You shouldn't have done that. Like hell, I shouldn't. Orson, these people control your livelihood, your partnerships, I don't care. You should. Celia stepped closer, and he could see genuine fear in her eyes now. I've lived in this town for 6 years. I know how it works. The wives decide who's acceptable, and the husbands enforce it. If Eleanor Crowley has decided I'm beneath you, she'll make sure everyone agrees. She'll freeze you out socially, economically, every way that matters. Let her try. This isn't about pride, Orson. This is about survival. Your ranch depends on cooperation with other ranchers. Water rights, grazing boundaries, political influence, it all requires goodwill. And if they decide you're no longer one of them, she trailed off, but the implication was clear. Orson took her hand. She tried to pull away, but he held firm. Look at me, he said. Celia, look at me. She did, reluctantly. I spent 15 years building that ranch alone, Orson said. 15 years of cold houses and empty conversations and pretending I didn't notice how lonely I was. Then I met you, and for the first time in longer than I can remember, I'm not lonely. I'm not pretending. I'm just myself. And if being myself means losing their approval, then I never really had it in the first place. Celia's eyes were wet. You're going to regret this. The only thing I'd regret is walking away from you to please people who've never cared about anything except my land and my money. A tear slipped down her cheek. I'm not worth this. You're worth everything. She kissed him. It wasn't soft or romantic or any of the things novels described. It was desperate and fierce and tasted like salt from her tears. It was two people who'd been alone too long finally finding each other and refusing to let go. When they broke apart, Celia was shaking. This is going to get worse before it gets better. I know. They're going to come after both of us. I know that too. And you're still staying? Orson pulled her close, pressed his forehead against hers. I'm not going anywhere. The Valley's reaction was swift and brutal. Within a week, 3 ranchers who'd previously been friendly suddenly had concerns about boundary disputes that hadn't existed before. 2 withdrew from a water-sharing agreement Orson had negotiated the previous year. Eleanor Crowley organized a social gathering for every prominent ranch family in the territory and made sure Orson wasn't invited. The message was clear: fall in line or be excluded. Orson didn't fall in line. Instead, he showed up at Celia's boarding house every Sunday like clockwork. He took her to dinner at the hotel on Main Street where whispers followed them like shadows. He introduced her to visiting businessmen as Miss Celia Mercer, the finest landlady in Wyoming Territory, with a defiance that dared anyone to contradict him. Celia endured it with her usual stoic grace, but Orson could see the toll it took. Her boarders started leaving without explanation. 2 families who'd previously used her laundry service quietly switched to a competitor. At the general store, conversation stopped when she entered. I should leave, she told Orson one evening as they sat in her garden. Go to Denver, maybe. Start over somewhere they don't know my name. Don't. Orson, I mean it. Don't leave. Don't let them win. Celia laughed bitterly. This isn't about winning. This is about survival. Every day I stay here, I lose another customer, another boarder, another piece of the life I built. Eventually, there will be nothing left. Then marry me. The words were out before Orson fully realized he'd decided. But once they hung in the air between them, he didn't take them back. Celia stared at him. What? Marry me. Not because I'm trying to save you or protect you or any of that noble nonsense. Marry me because I love you. Because I'd rather face every rancher in this territory with you beside me than spend another day pretending I don't care what they think while I'm actually dying inside from loneliness. Orson, I'm not saying it'll be easy. I'm not saying they'll accept it. But I'm saying I want to try. I want to build something real with you, not the hollow imitation everyone else seems satisfied with. Celia was crying openly now. They'll destroy us. Maybe. Or maybe we'll be stronger together than they expect. You're insane. Probably. She kissed him again, softer this time, but no less intense. When she pulled back, her eyes were still wet, but something had shifted in her expression. Determination, maybe. Or defiance. Ask me properly, she said. Orson smiled. Then he got down on one knee in the dirt of her vegetable garden, took her rough, work-worn hand in his, and said the most honest thing he'd ever spoken. Celia Mercer, will you marry me? Will you build a life with me that's real and difficult and probably too complicated for its own good? Will you argue with me when I'm wrong and support me when I'm right and never ever pretend to be anything you're not? Celia looked down at him, this powerful rancher kneeling in the mud like a supplicant, and made the most dangerous decision of her life. Yes, she said, but on one condition. Name it. I will never become someone else to satisfy this town. I won't soften my edges or lower my voice or apologize for having a mind of my own. I'll be your wife, but I'll still be myself. Can you live with that? I'm counting on it. She pulled him to his feet and into another kiss, and neither of them noticed the woman watching from across the street with narrowed, calculating eyes. Eleanor Crowley had just witnessed the engagement, and she was already planning her next move. The engagement should have been a beginning. Instead, it felt like a declaration of war. News spread through Cutter's Hollow faster than wildfire in dry grass. By the next morning, everyone from the telegraph operator to the school teacher knew that Orson Hale, the wealthiest, most influential rancher in Wyoming Territory, had proposed to a laundress in her vegetable garden. The reactions ranged from scandalized shock to barely concealed glee at the prospect of watching the mighty fall. Eleanor Crowley heard the news over breakfast and smiled into her coffee cup like she'd been dealt a winning hand. Orson first sensed the shift when he rode into town 3 days after the proposal. The usual morning greetings from shopkeepers were replaced with awkward nods or sudden fascination with their storefronts. Henderson at the general store was cordial enough, but his wife, who normally chatted freely about town gossip, suddenly remembered urgent inventory work in the back room. At the bank, where Orson had done business for 12 years, the manager's handshake was notably cooler. Heard congratulations are in order, the man said, his tone suggesting the opposite. Thank you, Charles. Quite a surprise. We all thought, well, never mind what we thought. Charles shuffled papers unnecessarily. I trust you've considered how this marriage might affect your business relationships? Orson's jaw tightened. My personal life is separate from my business. Is it? Charles leaned back in his chair. Because from where I sit, every major deal you've made in this territory has involved men whose wives socialize together, whose families intermarry, who expect certain standards. Celia Mercer exceeds any standard that matters. I'm sure she's a fine woman, but perception matters, Orson. Fair or not, that's reality. He paused. I'd hate to see your credit situation become complicated because of social difficulties. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Orson stood slowly, placing both hands flat on the desk. Are you telling me my credit depends on who I marry? I'm telling you that everything is connected. You know that better than anyone. Orson left without another word. Outside, he stood on the wooden walkway, taking deep breaths, trying to control the rage building in his chest. They were going to make this as difficult as possible. Not through direct confrontation, that wasn't how things worked out here, but through 1,000 small cuts. A delayed loan approval here, A withdrawn partnership there. Doors that had always been open suddenly requiring explanations. He rode to 4th Street. Celia was scrubbing floors when he arrived, her sleeves rolled up and sweat dampening her hairline despite the cool morning. She took one look at his face and sat back on her heels. That bad? The bank just implied my credit might become complicated if I marry you. Celia's expression didn't change, but something hardened in her eyes. So it begins. You knew they'd do this. Of course I knew. I've lived here long enough to understand how power works. She stood, wiping her hands on her apron. The question is whether you really understood what you were agreeing to. I understood. Did you? She moved closer and he could see genuine fear beneath her usual composure. Because understanding it in theory and living it in practice are very different things. They're going to isolate you, Orson, financially, socially, politically. Every advantage you've built over 15 years, they're going to try to take it away. And they won't stop until you either break or give me up. I'm not giving you up. Then you better be ready for a fight. Orson caught her hand, held it despite the soap and water still dripping from her fingers. I've been fighting this land for 15 years, fighting weather and wolves and every other damn thing the frontier throws at you. You think a bunch of small-minded hypocrites scare me? They should, because they're not fighting with fists or guns. They're fighting with money and influence and social pressure. The kind of fighting you can't win with stubbornness alone. Then what do I win it with? Celia looked at him for a long moment. Patience, strategy, and being willing to lose some battles to win the war. She squeezed his hand. But mostly, you win by not letting them break us apart. That's what they want. If we stay together, stay strong, eventually they'll realize we're not going anywhere. How long will that take? However long it takes. It wasn't a reassuring answer, but it was an honest one. Orson pulled her close, pressed his face into her hair, and tried to believe that love and stubbornness would be enough. 3 days later, the first real attack came. Orson was reviewing ranch accounts when Tom Brewster knocked on his office door with an expression that meant bad news. We've got a problem. What kind of problem? Legal kind. Samuel Garrett just filed a boundary dispute claim. Says our north fence line encroaches on his property by 40 yards. Orson looked up sharply. That fence has been there for 8 years. He never said a damn word about it. He's saying it now. Filed papers with the territorial court this morning. He's demanding we move the fence or pay damages. Samuel Garrett has never cared about 40 yards of scrub grass. Someone put him up to this. Tom shifted uncomfortably. Boss, Garrett's wife and Eleanor Crowley are cousins. There it was. The first real move in what was shaping up to be a calculated campaign. Orson stood, paced to the window, stared out at the ranch he'd built acre by painful acre. How much will fighting this cost? Legal fees, survey costs could run $500, maybe more. And that's if we win. If we lose, we're looking at damages plus moving that fence, which means relocating water troughs, rebuilding gates. Tom trailed off. It's a mess, boss. And if we settle? Garrett might accept a cash payment to drop it, but that sets a precedent. Every rancher with a grudge will suddenly remember some boundary dispute from years back. Orson closed his eyes. This was exactly what Celia had warned him about. Not a direct assault, but death by 1,000 cuts. Legal fees here, social isolation there, withdrawn partnerships everywhere. They'd bleed him slowly until he either broke or bent. Tell Garrett I'll meet with him, Orson said finally. You sure about that? No, but I'm sure I'm not backing down. The meeting took place 2 days later at a neutral location, the Cattlemen's Association building, with Martin Crowley serving as mediator. Orson arrived expecting Samuel Garrett. Instead, he found Garrett, Martin Crowley, and 2 other prominent ranchers, all wearing expressions of carefully orchestrated concern. This wasn't a negotiation. It was an intervention. Orson, thank you for coming, Martin gestured to a chair. We thought it best to address several issues at once. Several issues? The boundary dispute is just one concern. There are others. Orson remained standing. I'm listening. Martin exchanged glances with the other men. We've been friends a long time, Orson, partners in building this valley into something worthwhile. So we're speaking to you now as friends, hoping you'll hear us. Get to the point, Martin. The point is that your recent personal decisions are affecting more than just yourself. Your engagement to Miss Mercer has created social difficulties that are starting to impact business relationships throughout the territory. My engagement is none of your business. It is when it threatens cooperative agreements we've all relied on, Samuel Garrett interjected. Water rights, grazing rotations, joint roundups, all of that requires trust and goodwill. And right now, that goodwill is evaporating. Because I'm marrying someone you don't approve of? Because you're marrying someone inappropriate for your position, one of the other ranchers said bluntly. Your wife will be expected to socialize with our wives, attend our gatherings, represent your ranch in the community. Celia Mercer doesn't have the background or refinement for that role. The room went very quiet. Orson felt something cold and dangerous settle in his chest. Let me make sure I understand, he said softly. You're telling me that my choice of wife threatens your business interests because your wives don't want to share tea with a woman who actually works for a living? It's not that simple. It's exactly that simple. You're a bunch of cowards hiding behind business justifications because you're too afraid to admit you're taking orders from your wives. Orson looked at each man in turn. And you, Martin, standing there pretending this is about goodwill when we both know Eleanor orchestrated this whole meeting. Martin's face flushed. My wife has legitimate concerns. Your wife is a bully who can't stand seeing someone refuse to bow to her. And you're all so terrified of social exclusion that you're willing to threaten me on her behalf. Orson moved toward the door. Here's my answer. I'm marrying Celia Mercer. You can accept that or not. You can cooperate with my ranch or not. But I'm not changing my mind to make your wives comfortable. Orson, wait. Samuel Garrett stood. The boundary dispute is manufactured nonsense, and we both know it. You want to waste money on lawyers? Go ahead. I'll fight you in court and I'll win. And when I do, every rancher in this valley will know you used legal manipulation to do Eleanor Crowley's dirty work. He opened the door. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a ranch to run. He left them sitting there, stunned and silent. The victory felt good for approximately 3 hours. Then reality set in. Tom found him in the stables that evening, looking troubled. Boss, we need to talk. More good news? The water sharing agreement for the South Pastures? Henderson and Davies just pulled out. Said they're making other arrangements. Orson's hand stilled on the bridle he'd been mending. Those South Pastures depended on shared spring water during dry summers. Without the agreement, his cattle would have to be moved to less productive grazing land, reducing their weight gain and cutting into profits. They say why? No, but their wives were both at Eleanor Crowley's house for tea yesterday. Orson threw the bridle against the wall. His horse startled, snorting nervously. Tom wisely said nothing. How bad can this get? Orson asked finally. Honestly, bad. If enough ranchers withdraw cooperation, you'll be operating in isolation. That works for some things, but for water rights, grazing rotation, joint roundups, isolation is expensive, real expensive. So they're going to strangle me economically until I give up Celia. That's the plan, seems like. Orson looked out at his ranch, the barns and corrals, the thousands of acres stretching toward the mountains, the empire he'd built through sweat and determination and relentless will. Everything he'd worked for was being used as leverage to control his personal life. I need to see Celia, he said. He found her at the boarding house, going over accounts with a worried expression that told him her situation wasn't any better. She looked up when he entered, and her face softened slightly. Bad day? You could say that. You? I lost 2 more boarders this morning. Both said they'd found more suitable arrangements. Neither would look me in the eye when they said it. She set down her pen. Eleanor Crowley's been busy. Orson sat across from her, suddenly exhausted. They're withdrawing water-sharing agreements, manufacturing legal disputes, turning every cooperative arrangement into an obstacle. I know. My laundry business is down 60%. People who've used my services for years are suddenly washing their own clothes or going to the new place on 6th Street. She laughed without humor, which is run by Eleanor Crowley's sister-in-law, by the way. Not a coincidence. They sat in silence for a moment, both understanding the full scope of what they were facing. This wasn't a brief scandal that would blow over. It was a sustained, coordinated campaign designed to break them financially and socially. We could still call it off, Celia said quietly. The engagement, I mean. Tell people we realized we were rushing things. You'd lose some face, but they'd welcome you back eventually. And I could probably rebuild my business if you weren't in the picture anymore. No? Orson, no. He reached across the table, took her hand. I'm not walking away, not from you, not from this. They want me to choose between love and power. Fine. I choose love. Let them keep their social circles and their manufactured goodwill. I'll build something better. Something better might not pay the bills. Then we'll find a way to pay the bills anyway. He squeezed her hand. I didn't survive 15 years on this frontier by giving up when things got difficult. And I'm not starting now. Celia's eyes were wet, but she didn't cry. Instead, she stood, walked around the table, and pulled him into a fierce embrace. You're the most stubborn man I've ever met, she whispered. That's why you love me. It's one of the reasons. They held each other in the fading light of her small office. Two people bracing for a storm they both knew was far from over. The next attack came from an unexpected direction. Orson was meeting with a cattle buyer from Denver when the man suddenly shifted uncomfortably and cleared his throat. Mr. Hale, I need to ask you something, and I want you to know it's not personal. Orson's instincts immediately went on alert. Go ahead. I've been hearing rumors about your ranch, about management issues and stability concerns. What kind of concerns? That you're distracted, making poor decisions, that your judgment has become compromised by personal matters. The buyer held up a hand. I'm not saying I believe it, but my bosses in Denver asked me to verify your ranch is still a reliable source before we commit to a large contract. Orson felt cold fury building. My ranch has been a reliable source for 8 years. We've never missed a delivery, never provided substandard cattle. What exactly has changed? Nothing, as far as I can see. But rumors matter in this business, and the rumors are that you're facing financial difficulties, legal troubles, and that several of your key partnerships have dissolved. Who told you that? The buyer looked genuinely uncomfortable now. It came through unofficial channels. Other ranchers, suppliers, people connected to the territory's cattle business. They're suggesting I diversify my sources, use other ranches for supply. Let me guess, Martin Crowley's ranch was specifically recommended? The buyer's silence was answer enough. Orson stood. Tell your bosses in Denver that my ranch is exactly as stable as it's always been. The only thing that's changed is that I'm marrying a woman some people don't approve of, and they're using business relationships to punish me for it. If that kind of petty manipulation affects your decision-making, maybe we shouldn't be doing business anyway. Mr. Hale, my cattle will be ready for inspection next week as scheduled. You can verify their quality yourself. After that, the decision is yours. He walked out before the conversation could deteriorate further. Outside, he stood in the street taking deep breaths, trying to calm the rage threatening to overwhelm him. They weren't just attacking his social standing or his local partnerships. They were trying to destroy his reputation with outside buyers, poison the well so thoroughly that even people who'd never met him would hesitate to do business. It was sophisticated, coordinated, and devastatingly effective. That evening, Orson did something he hadn't done in years. He got drunk. Not falling down drunk, but drunk enough that Tom Brewster found him in his office with an empty whiskey bottle and a dangerous expression. Boss? They're going after my cattle contracts now, spreading rumors to Denver buyers that my ranch is unstable. Tom winced. I heard something about that. How long before word spreads to other markets? How long before every buyer in the territory hears that Orson Hale is compromised, unreliable, making poor decisions? He poured another drink with unsteady hands. How long before they succeed in destroying everything I built? Tom was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled up a chair and sat down heavily. You want the truth? Always. The truth is they might succeed. Not because you're actually making poor decisions, but because reputation is everything in this business. If enough people believe you're compromised, you become compromised, whether it's true or not. He paused. But here's the other truth. I've worked for you for 9 years. I've seen you fight droughts, disease, market crashes, and every other disaster this land can throw at a rancher. And you've never backed down, not once. This is different. Is it? Or is it just the same fight with different weapons? Tom leaned forward. These people, they're used to getting their way through social pressure. They're used to everyone caring what they think. But you've never really been one of them, boss. You've always been an outsider who forced his way in through sheer competence. Maybe it's time to remember that. Orson looked at his foreman through the whiskey haze. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting you stop trying to play their game and start playing yours. Stop defending yourself and go on offense. Stop worrying about their approval and make them worry about yours. How? The same way you built this ranch. Hard work, smart decisions, and not giving a damn what anyone thinks. The words settled over Orson like cold water, cutting through the alcohol and anger. Tom was right. He'd been so focused on defending against their attacks that he'd forgotten how to attack back. He'd been playing defense when his entire career had been built on aggressive expansion and calculated risk-taking. You think I should just ignore them? Orson asked. No. I think you should outwork them, outthink them, be so successful that their petty social games don't matter. Tom stood. And marry that woman anyway, because spite is a hell of a motivator. Despite everything, Orson laughed. Spite? Best reason I can think of. Prove them all wrong just to watch their faces. After Tom left, Orson sat alone in his office, thinking. The whiskey bottle stayed on the desk, but he didn't pour another drink. Instead, he pulled out his ledgers and started planning. If they wanted a war, he'd give them one. The first move came 3 days later. Orson rode to the neighboring property of Jacob Morrison, a moderate rancher who'd stayed neutral in the social conflict. Jacob came out to meet him, looking wary. Orson, Jacob, you got a minute? They sat on Jacob's porch. Orson didn't waste time on pleasantries. I know Martin Crowley and the others are pressuring you to cut ties with my ranch. Jacob shifted uncomfortably. It's complicated. It's not. They want to isolate me because I'm marrying someone they don't approve of. You can either join their petty crusade or continue doing business as usual. Your choice. It's not that simple. My wife. Is your wife running your ranch, or are you? Orson cut him off. Because from where I sit, if you let social pressure dictate your business decisions, you're not really running anything. Jacob bristled. That's not fair. None of this is fair. But here's what is true. My ranch has always been a good neighbor. We've shared water during droughts, helped with roundups, maintained fair boundary agreements. That's worth more than Eleanor Crowley's approval. And if you can't see that, you're a fool. And if I keep doing business with you, they'll freeze me out too. Maybe. Or maybe if enough people refuse to play their game, the game ends. Orson stood. I'm not asking you to take my side in some social war. I'm asking you to keep being a good neighbor. The rest will sort itself out. He left Jacob sitting on that porch, thinking. Over the next 2 weeks, Orson had similar conversations with a dozen ranchers. Some shut him down immediately. Others listened. A few, like Jacob Morrison, quietly agreed to maintain their existing partnerships regardless of social pressure. It wasn't enough to break the isolation, but it was enough to crack it. At the same time, Orson made a decision that would either save his reputation or destroy it completely. He rode to Samuel Garrett's ranch alone, without telling anyone where he was going. Garrett saw him coming and met him in the yard with a rifle in hand, not pointed at Orson, but visible. A warning. You're not welcome here, Hale. Orson dismounted slowly, hands visible. I'm not here to fight. Then why are you here? To talk about that boundary dispute. Man to man, no lawyers, no Martin Crowley mediating. Garrett's eyes narrowed. Nothing to talk about. That fence is on my land. Is it? Or did Eleanor Crowley convince you it was so you'd have an excuse to file papers against me? That's... Let me finish. Orson kept his voice level. You've been ranching that property for 11 years. I've been ranching mine for 12. In all that time, you never once mentioned that fence. Not when we negotiated the grazing rotation. Not when we worked together on the roundup last fall. Not once. Garrett said nothing, but something flickered in his expression. So either you suddenly developed extremely poor observation skills, Orson continued, or someone suggested you'd be doing the community a favor by making my life difficult. Which is it? A long silence. Then Garrett lowered the rifle slightly. Eleanor said you were making a fool of yourself. Said someone needed to show you the consequences of disrespecting the valley's standards. And you believed her? I believed my wife, who believed Eleanor. Garrett looked uncomfortable now. They said it was about maintaining community values. It's about control. Eleanor Crowley wants to control who marries who socializes with who does business with who, and she's using you, using all of us, to enforce that control. So what? You want me to just drop the dispute? I want you to come look at that fence with me, right now. Bring your surveyor if you want. Look at the markers, check the original boundaries, and tell me honestly if that fence is on your land or mine. Garrett studied him for a long moment. And if it is on my land, then I'll move it and pay reasonable damages. But if it's on mine, you drop the claim and admit this whole thing was manufactured. Eleanor will be furious, so let her be furious. Since when did grown men need permission from someone's wife to settle honest disputes? Something in Garrett's expression shifted. Maybe it was wounded pride at being called out. Maybe it was simple honesty reasserting itself. Either way, he lowered the rifle completely. Fine. Let's go look at the damn fence. They rode out together, an uneasy truce settling between them. Garrett brought his surveyor. They checked the original property markers, measured the distances, verified the boundaries. The fence was on Orson's land by 6 yards. Garrett stood there looking at the measurements, his face gradually reddening with either shame or anger. She told me it was 40 yards onto my property, he said finally. She lied. She lied. Garrett turned to his surveyor. You're willing to testify to this in court if needed? Yes, sir. Garrett looked at Orson. I'll drop the claim tomorrow. And Hale? I'm sorry, I let myself get used. Orson extended his hand. We all get used sometimes. They shook on it. Riding back to his ranch, Orson felt something shift in his chest. Not triumph exactly, but hope. One manufactured dispute down. If he could dismantle the others the same way, through direct confrontation and honest dealings, maybe he could survive this campaign after all. That evening, he told Celia what had happened. She listened with her usual careful attention, then surprised him by laughing. What's funny? You. Riding alone to confront a man with a rifle because you'd rather face violence than legal manipulation. It worked. This time. But Orson, Eleanor Crowley isn't going to stop just because you won one battle. She'll escalate. Let her. I'm done playing defense. Celia studied his face in the lamplight. You've got that look. What look? The one that says you're about to do something either brilliant or catastrophically stupid. She moved closer. Which is it? I'm going to marry you. Not next year. Not after things settle down. Next month. Celia went very still. Next month? They're trying to drag this out. Make us both suffer until we break. But if we just do it, get married quickly, present it as a done deal, they lose their leverage. Can't pressure me to call off an engagement that's already a marriage. They'll still isolate us socially, still attack us economically. Maybe. But they'll have to adjust their strategy. And every day we're actually married, living our lives despite their objections, their power decreases. He took her hands. I'm tired of waiting, Celia. Tired of letting them control the timeline. Let's just do it. She was quiet for a long time, thinking it through with that sharp mind he loved. There's risk, she said finally. Everything worth doing has risk. If we do this, there's no going back. No chance to reconsider if things get worse. I don't want to go back. Celia looked at him, really looked at him, searching for doubt or hesitation. She didn't find any. All right, she said. Next month. But Orson? Yeah? We do it our way. Small ceremony, people we actually care about. None of the social performance Eleanor would expect. If we're going to scandalize them anyway, might as well be thorough about it. Orson pulled her close and kissed her, and for the first time in weeks, the future felt like something other than an approaching disaster. They set the date for 3 weeks away. Told almost no one. Made no elaborate plans. Just a simple ceremony at the courthouse with Tom Brewster and Celia's 2 laundry helpers as witnesses. Eleanor Crowley heard about it anyway. She arrived at Celia's boarding house 2 days before the wedding like an avenging angel, sweeping through the door without knocking. Celia was washing windows when Eleanor appeared in the parlor, dressed in expensive silk and radiating cold fury. We need to talk. Celia climbed down from her stool, wiping her hands on her apron. Eleanor, what a surprise. Is it? You didn't think I'd hear about this absurd plan to marry Orson Hale in 3 days at some courthouse ceremony like common drifters? It's 2 days, actually, and we're not common drifters. We're 2 people getting married without requiring your approval or attendance. Eleanor's face flushed. You're destroying that man's reputation, his business relationships, his standing in this community. No, You're doing that by orchestrating a campaign against him because you can't stand that he chose me. I'm protecting this valley's standards. You're protecting your own sense of importance. Celia set down her cleaning rag and faced Eleanor directly. You've spent years controlling who socializes with who's acceptable and who isn't. And the moment someone like Orson, someone with actual power, refuses to follow your rules, you panic. Because if he can ignore you and survive, everyone else might realize they can too. Eleanor's expression turned venomous. You think you've won? You think marrying him changes anything? I'll make sure neither of you is welcome anywhere in this territory. Every door will close. Every business relationship will crumble. You'll spend the rest of your lives isolated and struggling, all because you were too arrogant to know your place. My place? Celia's voice dropped dangerously low. My place is wherever I decide it is, not where you tell me it should be. You're nothing, a laundress with delusions of grandeur. And yet I'm the one marrying Orson Hale while you stand in my boarding house threatening me like a spoiled child who didn't get her way. For a moment, Eleanor looked like she might actually strike her, but she regained control, smoothed her dress, and smiled coldly. Enjoy your wedding, Miss Mercer. It'll be the last happy day either of you have. She swept out the same way she'd entered, dramatic, imperious, and absolutely certain of her power. Celia stood alone in her parlor, shaking slightly with adrenaline and fear, and something that might have been exhilaration. She'd just made an enemy of the most influential woman in the territory, and there was no taking it back. But she'd also told the truth. And sometimes truth mattered more than safety. 2 days later, Celia Mercer became Celia Hale in a 5-minute ceremony that felt more real than any elaborate wedding could have. Orson's hands shook slightly when he slipped the ring on her finger. Celia's voice cracked when she said her vows. Tom Brewster cried, which surprised everyone, including himself. When the judge pronounced them married, Orson kissed his wife like they were the only two people in the world. Outside the courthouse, reality waited. But for one perfect moment, they didn't care. They'd chosen each other. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. And that would have to be enough. The ranch house felt different the morning after the wedding. Not physically, it was still the same sprawling timber structure Orson had built 10 years earlier, but the silence had changed. It wasn't empty anymore. It was waiting. Celia stood in the kitchen wearing one of Orson's old shirts over her nightgown, making coffee in the pre-dawn darkness. She'd been awake since 4, unable to sleep past the habits of 6 years running a boarding house. Through the window, she could see the first gray hints of sunrise touching the mountains. Behind her, floorboards creaked. Orson appeared in the doorway, hair disheveled, looking uncertain in a way she'd never seen before. "You're up early," he said. "Old habits." She poured 2 cups, handed him one. "I kept thinking I needed to start breakfast for boarders who aren't there anymore." They stood in the quiet kitchen, drinking coffee and adjusting to the strangeness of sharing space. Married less than 12 hours, and already the reality felt more complicated than the romance. "I sold the boarding house yesterday," Celia said suddenly. "Henderson's nephew made an offer last week. I accepted it." Orson set down his cup carefully. "You didn't tell me." "Didn't seem like the right time. You were dealing with Garrett's boundary dispute, then the wedding plans." She shrugged. "It's done now anyway. That place was yours. You built it from nothing. And now it's sold. Fresh start." Her voice was steady, but Orson heard the uncertainty beneath it. Celia had just given up the independence she'd fought 6 years to achieve. No matter how strong she acted, that had to hurt. "What will you do?" he asked. She looked at him like he'd asked a stupid question. "Help run this ranch. That's what you married me for, isn't it? A partner, not a decoration." "I married you because I love you." "That too. But love doesn't pay the bills or manage 43 employees or fix whatever Eleanor Crowley breaks next." She moved to the window, watching the ranch slowly emerge from darkness. "So, where do we start?" Orson came to stand beside her. "The accounts, I suppose. Tom's been managing them, but if you're serious about helping—" "I'm serious." "Then we start with the ledgers, after breakfast." What Celia found in those ledgers shocked her. They sat in Orson's office, now their office, with 10 years of financial records spread across the desk. Orson had expected some disorganization. He'd been running a ranch, not an accounting firm, but Celia's expression grew increasingly horrified as she worked through the numbers. "Orson." "Yeah?" When was the last time you reconciled these accounts? Tom handles that monthly. Tom is not handling it correctly. She held up a ledger page. You're paying for feed you already own, double ordering supplies because nobody's tracking inventory. And this, she pointed at another entry, you're paying 40% above market rate for leather goods from Sanders Supply. Sanders has always overcharged you, and you've never noticed because you were too busy actually running the ranch to check the numbers. She flipped through more pages, her expression darkening. How much profit did you show last year? Around 3,000. It should have been closer to 5. You're hemorrhaging money through inefficiency and overpayment. Orson felt defensive anger rising. I built this ranch from $12. I know, and it's impressive. But impressive doesn't mean efficient. She softened slightly. I'm not criticizing what you built. I'm saying we can make it better, stronger, more profitable. She was right. Orson knew she was right, but it still stung to hear that the empire he'd built had fundamental flaws he'd been too close to see. What do you suggest? He asked, trying to keep the irritation from his voice. First, we inventory everything, every piece of equipment, every head of cattle, every supply order. Then we renegotiate your supplier contracts. Then we set up proper bookkeeping systems so this doesn't happen again. That'll take weeks. Then it takes weeks. But at the end, you'll actually know what you own and what it costs. She met his eyes directly. Unless you'd rather I stay out of the business side? It was a test. They both knew it. Orson could agree and relegate Celia to the role of ranch wife, managing the household, hosting dinners, staying decorative and separate from the actual work. Or he could trust her, let her into the machinery of his life's work, and risk discovering he'd been doing things wrong for years. Start with the inventory, he said. Tom will help you. Celia's expression shifted, relief mixed with something like gratitude. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. You might regret this when you're elbow deep in feed supply contracts. I've scrubbed floors for drunken miners. I can handle contracts. Over the next 3 weeks, Celia tore apart and rebuilt the ranch's business operations with terrifying efficiency. She discovered duplicate supply orders that had been running for years. She found 3 vendors overcharging by significant margins. She reorganized the tool storage so workers stopped losing equipment. She even identified a grazing rotation problem that was reducing cattle weight gain by preventing them from accessing the best grass at optimal times. Tom Brewster watched this transformation with mixed feelings. On one hand, Celia's changes were clearly improving operations. On the other hand, they highlighted mistakes he'd been making for years. Boss, he said one afternoon, finding Orson mending fence in the south pasture. Can we talk? Orson straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. That's sort of the problem. Tom shifted uncomfortably. Celia's making a lot of changes, good changes, but what? But some of the men are grumbling, saying you brought in your new wife and now she's running everything, saying a woman shouldn't be telling them how to do their jobs. Orson's jaw tightened. What Celia's doing is fixing inefficiencies that have been costing us money for years, money that affects their wages and job security. I know that. You know that. But they see a woman who's been here 3 weeks giving orders like she owns the place. She does own the place. She's my wife. That's not how they see it. Tom paused. Look, I'm not saying they're right. I'm saying you need to address this before it becomes a bigger problem. That evening, Orson called a meeting of all the ranch hands. They gathered in the main barn after dinner, 43 men ranging from teenagers to veterans who'd been working cattle since before Orson was born. The mood was tense. Orson stood before them, Celia beside him. He could feel her nervousness even though her expression remained calm. I hear there's been talk, Orson said without preamble, about my wife making changes, taking control, overstepping her place. Uneasy silence. A few men looked at their boots. So let me be clear about something. Every change Celia's made has been at my request. Every inefficiency she's found, I asked her to find. Every contract she's renegotiated, I approved. He paused, letting that sink in. This ranch belongs to both of us now. And if that's a problem for anyone, the door's right there. More silence. Then one of the older hands, a weathered man named Dutch, who'd been with Orson since the beginning, spoke up. With respect, boss, it's not about ownership. It's about knowledge. Your wife's a smart woman, no doubt, But she doesn't know cattle, doesn't know this land. Some of these changes she's making, they sound good on paper but might not work in practice. Like what? Celia asked, speaking for the first time. Dutch looked surprised at being directly addressed. Well, like the grazing rotation change, you want to move cattle to the north pasture 2 weeks earlier than we normally do. That's right. That pasture floods in spring. We wait till mid-May for a reason. It flooded badly 3 years ago, Celia said calmly. Before that records show it was fine for early May grazing. Last year it was fine. This year the weather's been dry. So unless you have specific evidence it'll flood this spring, we're wasting 2 weeks of good grass by waiting. Dutch frowned. How do you know it flooded 3 years ago? I read 10 years of ranch logs, the ones Orson keeps in his office. Every problem, every solution, every decision worth recording. She looked around at the assembled men. I know I don't have your experience, but I can read, I can count, and I can spot patterns. That's not the same as knowing cattle, but it's not worthless either. The men exchanged glances. Orson could see the calculation happening, weighing their assumptions against the fact that she'd clearly done her homework. Fair enough, Dutch said finally, but if that pasture floods, we're moving them back to standard rotation. Agreed. I'm not trying to override experience. I'm trying to spot inefficiencies experience might have missed. The tension in the barn eased slightly. Not gone, but reduced from confrontation to cautious acceptance. After the meeting, as the men filed out, Tom pulled Orson aside. That went better than I expected. She prepared for it, spent 2 days reading every ranch log we have. Smart woman. That's what I keep telling people. Tom glanced at Celia, who was talking quietly with Dutch about spring weather patterns. Boss, I know I gave you grief about this marriage, but I was wrong. She's good for this place. Tell the others that. I will. But Orson? Tom's expression turned serious. Eleanor Crowley isn't done. You know that, right? I know. She's been quiet since the wedding. Too quiet. That woman doesn't give up easy. Neither do we. But Tom's warning proved prescient. 3 days later, the next attack came. Orson was negotiating with a hay supplier in town when the man suddenly went pale and stammered an excuse to leave. Confused, Orson turned to find Eleanor Crowley standing behind him, radiating cold satisfaction. Mrs. Crowley, he said evenly. Mr. Hale, enjoying married life? Very much. How nice. Though I notice your wife didn't accompany you to town today. Already tiring of civilization? Celia's managing ranch operations. Unlike some people, she works for a living. Eleanor's smile didn't waver. Indeed. I heard she's been making quite a few changes, reorganizing everything, questioning established practices, almost like she's trying to prove herself. She doesn't need to prove anything, doesn't she? Because from what I hear, she's alienating your workers with her constant interference. Dutch McGraw was at my house yesterday, expressing concerns about your wife's management style. Orson felt cold anger building. Dutch was at your house? Several of your men have been. They're worried, Orson. Worried that you've let your personal feelings compromise your judgment. Worried that this ranch they depend on for their livelihoods is being run into the ground by a woman with no ranching experience. That's a lie. Is it? Because I have 3 of your hands willing to testify that working conditions have deteriorated since your marriage, that morale is low, that they're considering seeking employment elsewhere. She paused. Of course, I'm sure they'd reconsider if the situation improved, if perhaps your wife took a step back from operations she doesn't understand. Orson understood immediately. Eleanor had gotten to some of his workers, fed them grievances, and was now using them as leverage. It was sophisticated manipulation disguised as concern. Get away from me, he said quietly. I'm trying to help. You're trying to destroy my marriage by turning my own workers against me, and it won't work. Because unlike you, I trust the people I employ to think for themselves. He walked away before she could respond. But riding back to the ranch, doubt crept in. Were the men really unhappy? Or had Eleanor simply found a few malcontents and amplified their complaints? He found out that evening when Dutch appeared at the ranch house asking to speak with him privately. They sat on the porch, the older man looking uncomfortable. Boss, I need to tell you something. Go ahead. Eleanor Crowley came to me last week. Said she was concerned about the ranch, about how you were doing after the marriage. Asked if I'd noticed any problems. And you told her? I told her the truth, that there'd been some grumbling about changes, but nothing serious. She twisted it around, made it sound like the whole crew was on the verge of mutiny. Dutch met Orson's eyes. I want you to know I didn't go to her house. She showed up at mine. And when I heard she was using what I said to threaten you, I came here immediately. Orson felt relief wash through him. I appreciate that. Your wife's doing good work, boss. The men see that now. The ones who don't are the same ones who complain about everything anyway. He paused. But Eleanor Crowley's not going to stop. She's got influence, and she's using it. Be careful. After Dutch left, Orson sat alone on the porch, staring out at his land. Celia emerged from the house, wrapped in a shawl against the evening chill. I heard, she said, sitting beside him. Dutch has a loud voice. Eleanor's trying to turn my own workers against us. I know. And she'll keep trying until something breaks or she finds a new target. Celia leaned against him. The question is what we do about it. What can we do? She controls half the social connections in this territory, but not all of them, and not the ones that matter most. Celia was quiet for a moment. We make this ranch so successful, so profitable, that her social games become irrelevant. We prove that we don't need her approval or her network to thrive. That's easier said than done. Most worthwhile things are. They sat in silence, watching the sun disappear behind the mountains. The ranch stretched out before them, thousands of acres of possibility and potential. Somewhere out there, Eleanor Crowley was planning her next move. But here, on this porch, two people who'd chosen each other despite every obstacle were planning theirs. The next morning, Celia made a discovery that changed everything. She was going through old supply contracts when she found a discrepancy in the feed purchase records. The ranch was buying grain at rates significantly higher than market value, had been for years. When she traced the supplier, she found a connection that made her stomach drop. The feed company was owned by Martin Crowley, Eleanor's husband. Celia brought the records to Orson immediately. Look at this. He reviewed the numbers, his expression darkening. We're being overcharged by 30%. And it's not an accident. These rates are deliberately inflated. They've been slowly increasing every year, small enough that you wouldn't notice, but large enough to add up. She pointed at the total. Over 5 years, you've overpaid by nearly $800. Orson felt rage building. Eleanor's not just attacking us socially. Her husband's been robbing us financially. For years, probably. Long before our engagement. This is how they operate. Overcharge the ranchers who don't check their numbers, use the profits to expand their own influence. What do we do? Celia's expression was calculating. We cancel the contract, find a new supplier, and we spread the word about what Martin's been doing. Let other ranchers check their own feed contracts. That'll make enemies. We already have enemies. Might as well have honest ones. Over the next week, Orson quietly contacted other ranchers, suggesting they review their supply contracts with Crowley Feed and Grain. The results were explosive. 7 ranchers discovered they'd been similarly overcharged. One had been paying inflated rates for nearly a decade. The backlash against Martin Crowley came swiftly. 3 ranchers canceled their contracts immediately. 2 more demanded renegotiation. At the next Cattlemen's Association meeting, Martin faced a room full of angry men demanding explanations. Eleanor Crowley's social power, it turned out, couldn't protect her husband from accusations of systematic theft. But the victory came with consequences. The Crowleys now had motivation beyond social propriety. They'd been exposed and humiliated. That made them more dangerous, not less. The retaliation came in early summer during the busiest time of the ranching calendar. Orson was preparing for the spring roundup when he received word that his water rights claim to Miller Creek, a claim he'd held for 8 years without dispute, was being challenged in territorial court. The plaintiff was a mining company from Denver. The lawyer representing them was Martin Crowley's cousin. This is insane, Orson told Celia, pacing their bedroom while she tried to sleep. Miller Creek has never had mining activity. There's no legitimate claim here. It doesn't need to be legitimate, Celia said tiredly. It just needs to be expensive and time-consuming. They're trying to bleed you dry with legal fees. So what do I do? You fight it. You hire the best water rights lawyer you can find, and you win. She sat up, looking at him seriously. But Orson, this is going to cost money we don't have readily available. We might need to take a loan. From who? The bank's already making things difficult. From Denver. From investors who don't care about Eleanor Crowley's social wars. She paused. Or we sell some assets. Quickly, before word gets out that we're desperate. Orson felt like he was drowning. Every victory led to a new attack. Every solution created new problems. He thought marrying Celia would be the hard part. He hadn't understood that the hard part would be surviving what came after. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I brought you into this. Celia got out of bed, walked to him, and slapped him across the face. Orson stared at her, shocked. Don't, she said, her voice shaking with anger. Don't you dare apologize for marrying me. Don't you dare suggest this is your fault or your burden. We're in this together. That was the deal. So stop apologizing and start fighting. Celia, I mean it. You want to survive Eleanor Crowley? Then stop acting like a victim and start acting like the man who built an empire from $12. She grabbed his face, forcing him to meet her eyes. I didn't marry you because I needed protection. I married you because I saw someone worth standing beside. So stand up straight and figure out how we win this. Something in Orson's chest unclenched. She was right. He'd been so focused on defending what he had that he'd forgotten how to build, how to push forward aggressively instead of just holding ground. Okay, he said. Okay. We fight. They spent that night planning. By morning, they had a strategy. First, they would hire the water rights lawyer, using money from selling a small parcel of land that Orson had been holding as future expansion. The parcel wasn't critical to current operations, and it would raise enough capital to fund the legal battle without taking a loan. Second, Celia would approach Jacob Morrison and the other neutral ranchers, making the case that if the Crowleys could successfully challenge Orson's water rights, they could challenge anyone's. It was in everyone's interest to support him, even if they disapproved of his marriage. Third, they would use the roundup as an opportunity to demonstrate competence. Let every rancher in the valley see that the Hale Ranch was running smoothly, efficiently, and profitably despite all the attacks. It was a good plan. It might even work. But first, they had to survive the roundup. The spring roundup was controlled chaos. Hundreds of cattle scattered across thousands of acres needed to be gathered, counted, branded, and sorted. It required coordination between multiple ranches, dozens of workers, and careful management of resources. Any ranch that couldn't handle its portion effectively lost respect and influence. Orson had been running successful roundups for 10 years, but this year felt different. This year, everyone was watching to see if his marriage had compromised his competence. Celia understood this instinctively. On the first day of the roundup, she appeared at breakfast dressed in practical riding clothes, her hair tied back severely. "What are you doing?" Orson asked. "Helping." "Celia, roundup's dangerous work. I can ride, I can count, and I can prove to every man out there that I'm not some delicate city woman who faints at the sight of cattle." She met his eyes. "Unless you think I can't handle it?" "I think you can handle anything. I'm worried about what happens if you get hurt." "Then worry while I work." She rode out with this crew that morning, and Orson watched her with a mixture of pride and terror. Celia wasn't an experienced rider, but she was fearless and quick to learn. When a steer broke from the group, she chased it down. When the count came up short, she rechecked the tallies and found the error. When one of the younger hands got thrown from his horse, she helped him up without making a fuss. By the end of the first day, the men were no longer muttering about the boss's wife interfering. They were impressed. By the end of the week, several ranchers from neighboring properties had noticed. During a break in the work, Jacob Morrison pulled Orson aside. "Your wife's something else." "I know. Eleanor Crowley's been telling everyone she's soft, that you married beneath your station, but watching her work..." Jacob shook his head. "That woman's got more grit than half the ranch wives in this valley." "Don't let Eleanor hear you say that." "Eleanor can say what she wants. Facts are facts. And the fact is, your ranch is running better than it has in years." He paused. "About that water rights dispute. Several of us have been talking. If you need supporting testimony about your historical use of Miller Creek, you'll have it." Orson felt unexpected emotion tighten his throat. "I appreciate that. Just being smart. Today it's your water rights. Tomorrow it could be mine. Better to stop this kind of legal manipulation before it becomes standard practice." Word of Jacob's support spread. Within days, 4 other ranchers quietly approached Orson, offering similar backing. It wasn't friendship, These men still disapproved of his marriage, still found Celia unsuitable by their social standards. But it was pragmatic alliance, and that was almost more valuable. The roundup ended successfully. The cattle counts were excellent. The efficiency was notable. And most importantly, everyone who'd been watching for signs of failure or incompetence found none. That evening, Orson and Celia collapsed on their bed, exhausted and filthy and satisfied. "We did it," Celia said. "You did it. The way you worked today, we did it," she insisted. "Together." Orson pulled her close despite the dirt and sweat. "I love you. I know, that's why this is going to work." 3 weeks later, during one of the hottest stretches of early summer, Celia realized she was pregnant. She'd suspected for a while. The nausea, the exhaustion that felt different from normal tiredness, the way certain smells made her stomach revolt. But she'd pushed it aside, too busy with ranch work and legal battles to pay attention to her own body. When she finally acknowledged the truth, she sat alone in the kitchen for an hour trying to process what this meant. A baby. A child. Something permanent and fragile and terrifyingly real. She told Orson that evening after dinner. He'd been reviewing depositions for the water rights case when she sat down across from him. "I need to tell you something." He looked up, immediately alert to the tension in her voice. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. At least, I don't think it is." She took a breath. "I'm pregnant." Orson went completely still. His expression was unreadable. "Say something," Celia said after the silence stretched too long. "How long?" "I don't know exactly. Maybe 2 months?" More silence. Celia felt panic building. Was he angry? Disappointed? Scared? Then Orson stood abruptly, walked around the desk, pulled her to her feet, and kissed her with such fierce joy that she forgot to breathe. When they broke apart, she saw tears on his face. "Orson, I'm going to be a father." His voice cracked. "We're going to have a child. Are you happy?" He laughed, actually laughed, and pulled her close again. Happy doesn't cover it. Terrified, overwhelmed, completely unprepared, but yes, happy. They held each other in the fading light. Two people who'd fought so hard to be together, now facing the prospect of creating something entirely new. "This changes things," Celia said eventually. "How?" "I can't work the roundup next year. Can't ride like I did this month. Can't. We'll figure it out. Eleanor will see this as weakness, proof that I'm not capable of being a rancher's wife." "Eleanor can go to hell." Celia smiled against his chest. "Eventually, yes, but first we have to survive her." They decided not to announce the pregnancy yet. Too many things could go wrong in the early months, and giving Eleanor Crowley another target felt dangerous. So they kept the secret, and Celia continued working, more carefully now, avoiding heavy lifting and dangerous work, but still present and engaged in ranch operations. The changes were subtle enough that most people didn't notice, but Tom Brewster did. He found Celia in the office one afternoon looking pale and exhausted. "You all right?" "Fine. Just tired." Tom studied her for a moment. "You're pregnant." It wasn't a question. Celia considered lying, then decided Tom deserved the truth. "Yes, but we're not announcing it yet." "Why not?" "Because we don't need to give Eleanor Crowley more ammunition." Tom was quiet for a moment. "For what it's worth, I think it's good news. This ranch could use some life in it." "Thank you, Tom. But Celia, be careful. I know you want to prove yourself, but you're carrying something more important than anyone's opinion." The words stayed with her. That night, lying beside Orson in the darkness, she put his hand on her stomach even though there was nothing to feel yet. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Of what?" "Everything. Childbirth, motherhood, raising a child in a place where half the valley thinks I'm beneath them." She paused. "What if they treat our baby the way they treat me?" Orson's hand tightened on her stomach. "Then they'll answer to me, and to you, and to every person in this valley who values actual character over arbitrary class distinctions. That's not a lot of people. It's enough. And it's growing. You saw how the men responded during Roundup, how Jacob and the others are supporting us on the water rights case. Things are changing, Celia, slowly, but they're changing." She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that love and determination and sheer stubbornness could overcome entrenched social hierarchies. But believing felt dangerous. Hope felt like a vulnerability she couldn't afford. "What if we lose?" she whispered. "The court case, the social battle, everything we're fighting for. What if we end up isolated and struggling, raising our child in poverty because we were too proud to compromise? Then we struggle together, and we teach our child that some things are worth fighting for, even when you lose." He shifted to face her in the darkness. "But we're not going to lose, because we're smarter, tougher, and more determined than anyone who's against us." Celia kissed him, trying to absorb his certainty, his unshakable belief that they could win through sheer force of will. The next morning, word came that they'd won the water rights case. The mining company's claim was dismissed as baseless, and Orson retained full rights to Miller Creek. It was their first clear, undeniable victory. Not a compromise or a partial win, but a complete defeat of the Crowleys' attempt to destroy them through legal manipulation. Tom brought champagne to dinner that night. Celia, who couldn't drink, toasted with water and felt something like hope beginning to take root. "We did it," she said to Orson after Tom left. "We did. What do you think Eleanor does now?" "Whatever she does, we'll handle it." But for one evening, they allowed themselves to celebrate, to imagine that maybe, just maybe, the worst was behind them, that their child would be born into a valley that had learned to accept them, even respect them. It was a beautiful fantasy, and it lasted exactly 3 more weeks. The drought started so gradually that nobody noticed at first. June was always dry in Wyoming territory, the kind of heat that baked the ground hard and turned grass brittle. But by mid-July, when the usual afternoon thunderstorms failed to materialize, people began paying attention. By August, they were worried. By September, they were desperate. Miller Creek, which Orson had fought so hard to keep rights to, slowed to a trickle. The larger creeks held on longer, but even they began dropping. Waterholes that had never failed in living memory turned to cracked mud. Cattle clustered around the few remaining sources, trampling the banks into swamps and fouling what little water remained. Orson stood at the edge of his largest water source, watching it shrink day by day, and felt a familiar cold fear settle in his chest. He'd survived droughts before, but he'd never faced one while pregnant with his first child and locked in a social war with half the valley's most powerful families. Celia joined him at the creek, moving more slowly now that she was 5 months along. Her pregnancy was obvious now, impossible to hide, and the announcement had created exactly the reaction she'd feared. Eleanor Crowley had made sure everyone knew that Celia was proving herself unsuitable by being with child so soon, as if pregnancy itself was evidence of poor judgment. "How bad?" Celia asked, looking at the diminished water. "Bad enough. If we don't get rain in the next 2 weeks, I'll have to start moving cattle to the North Range. But that means sharing water sources with Morrison's herd, and his stock is already straining his supply." "What about the other ranchers?" "Same problem. Everyone's scrambling for water that doesn't exist." He turned to her. "This could get ugly, Celia. When water gets scarce, cooperation breaks down fast. Men start protecting their own, boundaries get disputed, and violence becomes a real possibility. Then we need to stop it before it gets there." "How?" Celia was quiet for a long moment, thinking. "Cooperation. A formal agreement between ranches to share water sources fairly. Rationing based on herd size and need, with consequences for anyone who takes more than their share. You think ranchers facing ruin will voluntarily limit their water access? I think they'll do it if the alternative is watching their cattle die while they fight over dried-up creek beds." She met his eyes. "But it needs to come from someone neutral, someone both sides trust." "There is no neutral party. Everyone's already picked sides in our little war." "Then we make it about survival, not sides. We present it as practical necessity, not social politics." Orson wanted to believe it could work, but he'd seen what drought did to men, how it stripped away civilization and left only desperation. Still, the alternative was chaos, and chaos would destroy everyone. "I'll talk to Jacob Morrison," he said. "See if he's willing to host a meeting." The meeting happened 3 days later in Morrison's barn. Every major rancher in the territory received an invitation. Some came out of curiosity. Others came because their water situation was already critical. A few, like Martin Crowley, came to make sure their interests were protected. Eleanor Crowley came too, though she had no official role. She sat in the back of the barn beside her husband, watching everything with calculating eyes. Jacob Morrison stood before the assembled ranchers, looking uncomfortable with the attention. "Thank you all for coming. I know we've had our differences, but Drought doesn't care about politics, so we're here to discuss water sharing. Orson Hale has some ideas, and I think we should hear him out." All eyes turned to Orson. He saw skepticism, hostility, and in a few faces, desperate hope. "We all know the situation," Orson began. "Water's scarce and getting scarcer. If we don't coordinate access, we'll end up fighting over what's left while our herds die of thirst. So I'm proposing a cooperative agreement. Every ranch gets allocated water based on herd size and proximity to sources. We rotate access, monitor usage, and enforce limits. Anyone who violates the agreement faces penalties from the group." "Who decides the allocations?" Martin Crowley asked. "A committee. 3 ranchers elected by the group, serving rotating terms." "And who enforces penalties?" "The committee, backed by territorial law if necessary." Martin leaned back, skepticism written across his face. "You're asking us to hand control of our water rights to a committee? To trust that they'll be fair when their own herds are dying? I'm asking you to cooperate instead of fighting, because fighting uses energy and time none of us can afford to waste." Easy for you to say, you've got Miller Creek, which is down to 1/4 of normal flow and dropping daily. I'm in the same situation as everyone else. Eleanor spoke for the first time, her voice carrying across the barn. "Are you, though? Because from where I sit, this proposal benefits you enormously. You get to present yourself as the reasonable voice of cooperation while ensuring your ranch gets equal access to water sources you don't own." "Everyone gets equal access proportional to their need," Orson corrected. "That's literally the point." "And who determines need? Who verifies herd counts? Who prevents manipulation?" She stood, commanding attention effortlessly. "Gentlemen, what Mr. Hale is proposing sounds noble, but it requires trust we have no reason to give. Trust that the committee will be impartial. Trust that allocations will be fair. Trust that enforcement won't be weaponized against rivals." Several men nodded. Orson felt control of the meeting slipping away. Then Celia stood up. She'd been sitting quietly to the side, taking notes, trying to stay unobtrusive despite her obvious pregnancy. Now she moved to the center of the barn, and every eye tracked her movement. "Mrs. Crowley makes valid points," Celia said calmly. "Trust is essential. So let me address those concerns directly." She held up a leather-bound notebook. "I've spent the last week documenting every major water source in the territory: location, historical flow rates, current conditions, and proximity to ranch boundaries. I've calculated herd sizes based on the last 3 years of cattle counts, and I've drafted a proposed allocation system that accounts for all of it." She set the notebook on a barrel in the center of the barn. "It's all here. Every number, every calculation, every assumption. Anyone can review it, challenge it, or propose modifications. This isn't about trust. It's about transparency." The barn went silent. Eleanor's expression shifted to barely concealed anger. One of the older ranchers, a man named Hayes, who'd been neutral throughout the social conflict, stood and walked to the barrel. He opened the notebook, began reading. After several minutes, he looked up. "This is thorough. More thorough than anything I've seen from the Cattlemen's Association in 10 years. It's also accurate," Jacob Morrison added. "I checked my own ranch's numbers. She got the herd count exactly right, down to the last calf." Other ranchers moved forward, examining the documentation. Orson watched them discover what he already knew. Celia had done her homework. Every figure was verifiable, every allocation justified by clear logic and fair mathematics. "This still doesn't address enforcement," Martin Crowley said, though his voice had lost some of its certainty. "Enforcement is simple," Celia replied. "Every ranch appoints one person to monitor their own usage and report to the committee weekly. Anyone caught exceeding their allocation loses water access for 1 week, which hurts them far more than it hurts the group. Self-interest becomes the enforcement mechanism." "And the committee?" "Elected quarterly by secret ballot. Any rancher can serve, but no one can serve consecutive terms. That prevents consolidation of power." Slowly, grudgingly, the ranchers began to see the logic. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than chaos. And Celia's documentation made it hard to dismiss as manipulation or self-interest. Hayes spoke again. "I move we adopt this system on a trial basis. 1 month. See how it works. Second, Jacob Morrison said immediately. All in favor? Hands rose. Not all of them. Martin Crowley abstained, as did 2 of his closest allies, but enough. A clear majority. The water-sharing agreement passed. Eleanor Crowley walked out without a word, her back rigid with fury. After the meeting, several ranchers approached Celia directly. Hayes shook her hand. That was impressive work, Mrs. Hale. Thank you. My wife's been saying you're unsuitable for ranch life. I'm going to tell her she's wrong. It was a small thing, but it mattered. One voice of support, one crack in Eleanor's wall of social control. That night, Orson and Celia sat on their porch watching the sunset over the drought-stricken land. You were magnificent today, Orson said. I was prepared. That's different. No, you were magnificent. You took Eleanor's arguments and dismantled them with facts she couldn't dispute. He paused. You know this makes things worse between us and the Crowleys, right? I know. But people were going to die if we let this devolve into water wars. Cattle would die. Ranches would fail. Someone had to offer a better option. So you did. We did. This was your idea first. They held hands, finding comfort in each other's presence, while the valley slowly darkened around them. Inside, their child moved for the first time, a flutter Celia had felt earlier but hadn't mentioned. She placed Orson's hand on her stomach and waited. There. A small kick. Orson's face transformed with wonder. That's our baby. Very much alive and very active. He kept his hand there, feeling the small movements, and Celia saw tears on his face again. This man who could face down hostile ranchers and legal threats without flinching turned into someone completely vulnerable the moment his child moved. We're going to be okay, he said, though she wasn't sure if he was reassuring her or himself. Yes, we are. The water-sharing agreement worked better than anyone expected. The committee, consisting of Hayes, Morrison, and a neutral rancher from the Eastern Territory, proved surprisingly fair. Allocations were enforced, violations were rare and swiftly penalized. Most importantly, the cooperation prevented the spiral into conflict that drought usually triggered. But success created new problems. Within 2 weeks, other valley residents began approaching the committee with their own needs. Small homesteaders who weren't part of the Cattlemen's Association but still depended on shared water sources. A few struggling widow women trying to maintain small herds. Even some townspeople whose wells were running dry. The committee, designed only for major ranchers, wasn't equipped to handle these additional requests. Celia saw the gap and moved to fill it. She began holding informal meetings at the ranch house every Wednesday afternoon. Anyone could come, present their situation, and receive advice on water management, herd reduction, or resource sharing. She didn't make decisions, that remained with the committee, but she helped people understand the system and find solutions within it. The first week, 3 people came. The second week, 7. By the 4th week, Celia's Wednesday meetings had become a valley institution, with 20 or more people crowding into her parlor seeking guidance. Eleanor Crowley heard about the meetings and saw them for what they were, a direct challenge to her social authority. For years, Eleanor had been the person people came to for favors, for social access, for the kind of influence that opened doors. Now Celia was offering something more valuable, practical help during a crisis. The confrontation came on a Wednesday in late September. Celia was helping a young widow calculate sustainable herd reduction when Eleanor walked into her parlor unannounced. The room went silent. Everyone knew who Eleanor was, knew the history between these 2 women. Mrs. Crowley, Celia said evenly, can I help you? I'd like a private word. I'm in the middle of a meeting. It won't take long. Celia looked at the widow, who nodded nervously. I'll wait outside. Once the room cleared, Eleanor closed the door and turned on Celia with undisguised contempt. What exactly do you think you're doing? Helping people manage through a drought. You're positioning yourself as some kind of valley authority, playing savior to desperate people who don't know any better. I'm sharing information, that's all. You're undermining established social structures, making yourself indispensable so people forget you're a jumped-up laundress who married above her station. Eleanor's voice was ice. Did you really think I wouldn't notice? That I'd let you build your own power base in my valley? Your valley? Celia stood, moving slowly due to her pregnancy but losing none of her presence. Last I checked, this territory doesn't belong to you, Eleanor. You've convinced yourself it does because people have been too polite or too scared to contradict you. But reality doesn't require your permission. Eleanor's face flushed with rage. You have no idea what you've started. The consequences of making an enemy of me. I have some idea. You've spent months trying to destroy my husband's business, poison his relationships, and force us into poverty. You failed at all of it, so forgive me if your threats feel less impressive than you intend. Failed? Eleanor laughed bitterly. You think you've won because a few ranchers accepted your water scheme? Because some desperate homesteaders come begging for scraps of your wisdom? She stepped closer. I've been tolerant so far, restrained, but you've just exhausted my patience. What are you going to do, Eleanor? You've already tried everything short of actual violence. There are other ways to destroy someone, ways that don't require violence, ways that hurt more because they're perfectly legal and socially acceptable. She moved toward the door. Enjoy your little meetings while they last, because winter is coming, Mrs. Hale, and winter changes everything. She left. Celia stood alone in her parlor, heart pounding, hand unconsciously protective over her pregnant belly. That evening, she told Orson about the confrontation. She's planning something, Celia said. Something bigger than what she's tried before. Let her plan. We'll deal with whatever she does. Orson, she's right about one thing. Winter changes everything. If the drought continues, if we go into winter with already scarce water and then everything freezes... She trailed off, not wanting to voice the full horror of that scenario. Then we prepare. We plan. We make sure we have enough stored water and feed to last until spring. What about the others? The small homesteaders, the widows, the people who barely made it through summer? We help them too, same as we've been doing. Celia shook her head. That's what Eleanor's counting on. She knows we'll try to help everyone, stretch ourselves thin, drain our resources trying to save people she's abandoned. And when we fail, when we can't save everyone, she'll use that failure to prove we were never fit to lead in the first place. So what do you suggest? I don't know. That's what scares me. They went to bed that night with no answers, just a growing sense that the hardest part was still ahead. The first snow came in early October, unusually early even for Wyoming territory. It fell heavy and wet, briefly raising hopes that the drought might break. But the snow melted within days, and what little moisture it provided evaporated quickly in the cold, dry air that followed. By mid-October, several small homesteads were in crisis. Herds were already reduced to minimum levels. Wells that should have recovered with snow remained dry. Families who'd been scraping by through summer faced the prospect of winter with no water reserves and no feed for their stock. One such family, the Thompsons, who ran a small operation east of the main valley, came to Celia's Wednesday meeting looking desperate. We can't make it through winter, Mrs. Thompson said bluntly. We've reduced the herd to nothing, sold everything we can spare, and we still don't have enough feed or water to last until spring. Have you talked to the water committee? Celia asked. They gave us an allocation, but our well's dry. The allocation doesn't help if we can't access it. She looked at Celia with exhausted eyes. We're going to have to sell out. Leave. There's nothing else to do. Around the room, other families nodded in grim recognition. They were all facing similar calculations, wondering who would fold first and how many would follow. Celia thought quickly. What if we pooled resources? Families in crisis move temporarily to ranches with better water access. You bring your reduced herds, work in exchange for water and feed, survive the winter together instead of separately. Who'd take us in? Thompson asked. Most of the big ranches are barely managing their own operations. Some might, if we coordinate it, if we make the case that cooperation serves everyone's interests. After the meeting ended, Celia drafted a proposal and brought it to the water committee. Hayes and Morrison listened carefully, but their expressions were doubtful. It's a generous idea, Hayes said, but it asks a lot. Ranchers are already stretched thin. Taking in additional families, additional herds, even small ones, creates burden and risk. The alternative is watching those families fail and leave, Celia argued, which reduces the valley's population, weakens the community, and creates abandoned properties that attract squatters and trouble. Morrison nodded slowly. She's not wrong. Empty homesteads become problems. I'm not saying she's wrong. I'm saying it's a hard sell, especially to ranchers who are already resentful of the Hales' influence. Hayes looked at Celia directly. You've done good work with the water agreement, but asking people to take in struggling families during a drought? That's asking for charity, not cooperation. And charity's in short supply. Celia left the meeting frustrated. Hayes was right. She was asking for charity. But what else could she offer? What incentive existed for successful ranchers to help failing ones beyond simple human decency? The answer came to her 3 days later while reviewing the ranch accounts. Labor. Struggling homesteaders had something valuable to trade. Labor. Not just for the winter, but for spring roundup, summer haying, fall harvest. Skilled workers were always in demand, and families desperate enough to accept temporary relocation were families desperate enough to work hard. She refined the proposal. Struggling families could relocate temporarily to larger ranches. In exchange for water, feed, shelter, they'd provide labor. Not as charity cases, but as employees earning their keep. Come spring, they'd return to their own properties with enough resources to rebuild. It transformed charity into business arrangement. Celia brought the revised proposal to Orson first. He read it, thought about it, then nodded. This could work. But we'd need to lead by example. Take in at least one family ourselves. 2, Celia said. The Thompsons and the Yates family. Both have experience with cattle, both are capable workers, and both are about to lose everything. That's a lot of extra mouths to feed. We can manage it, especially with the extra labor for winter work. Orson looked at his pregnant wife with something like awe. You're sure about this? No, but I'm sure doing nothing is worse. They presented the revised proposal at the next Cattlemen's Association meeting. The reaction was mixed. Some ranchers saw the logic immediately. Others remained skeptical. Martin Crowley opposed it outright, calling it a scheme to increase the Hales' workforce at other ranchers' expense. But Jacob Morrison backed it. So did Hayes. And when Orson announced he was already taking in 2 families, several others grudgingly agreed to consider it. By early November, 8 families had been relocated to larger ranches under the labor exchange program. It wasn't enough to save everyone, but it was enough to prevent complete collapse. Eleanor Crowley watched these developments with barely concealed fury. Every success Celia achieved, every family saved, every rancher who grudgingly acknowledged her competence, it all eroded Eleanor's social authority. The woman who'd controlled the valley through fear and exclusion was being slowly replaced by someone offering practical solutions instead of social manipulation. The breaking point came in mid-November. Celia was 8 months pregnant, moving slowly, obviously tired but still hosting her Wednesday meetings. Nearly 30 people crowded into her parlor that week, seeking advice on everything from frozen water troughs to feed rationing. Eleanor arrived late, pushing through the crowd with 2 other ranch wives in tow. She didn't wait for the current discussion to finish. She simply interrupted. I have something to say. The room went silent. Celia, who'd been advising a young rancher on grazing rotation, turned slowly. Mrs. Crowley, I'll be with you when we finish here. No, you'll listen now. Eleanor's voice carried authority born of years controlling social dynamics. I've watched you hold these meetings for weeks, watched you position yourself as some kind of valley authority. And I've remained quiet out of courtesy and hoped that you'd eventually recognize the inappropriateness of your behavior. My behavior? A woman in your condition should be resting, preparing for childbirth, not hosting meetings and conducting ranch business. It's unseemly. More than that, it's dangerous. To you, to your child, and to the people who depend on advice from someone clearly not in her right mind. Several people gasped. Celia felt cold rage building but kept her voice level. I appreciate your concern for my health. However, my physician says I'm fine, and my husband supports my continued involvement in ranch operations. Your opinion, while noted, isn't required. My opinion reflects the Valley's standards, standards you've consistently refused to respect. Eleanor looked around the room, making sure everyone was paying attention. These meetings need to stop. You're not a doctor, not a territorial official, not anyone with actual authority to be advising people on survival matters. You're a pregnant woman playing at being important, and someone needs to tell you the truth before people get hurt following your amateur advice. The room erupted. Half the people tried defending Celia. The other half looked uncertain, influenced by Eleanor's confident authority. The young widow Celia had helped weeks earlier stood up, voice shaking but determined. Mrs. Hale saved my herd. Her advice was better than anything I got from the Cattlemen's Association. Because you're desperate and vulnerable, Eleanor said, not unkindly, which makes you susceptible to anyone offering false hope. But hope doesn't survive winter. Competence does. And Mrs. Hale, for all her good intentions, simply doesn't have the experience or judgment to guide you through this crisis. Celia stood slowly, using the chair for support. Her pregnant belly was obvious, her exhaustion visible, but her voice cut through the chaos with absolute clarity. You're right about one thing, Eleanor. I'm not an experienced rancher. I've been doing this less than a year. But you know what I am? I'm someone who listens, who does research, who checks numbers and verifies facts before offering advice. And most importantly, I'm someone who actually cares whether these people survive, instead of caring whether they follow proper social protocols. You have no authority. I have the authority people choose to give me by walking through my door and asking for help. That's the only authority that matters. Not social position, not family connections, not decades of controlling who gets invited to which gatherings. Celia moved toward Eleanor, closing the distance despite her awkward movements. You're terrified because people are choosing practical help over social approval, choosing survival over status. And you can't manipulate or intimidate your way out of that reality. Eleanor's face went white with rage. You've made a grave mistake, Mrs. Hale, one you'll regret for the rest of your life. Funny, I was about to say the same thing to you. Eleanor left, the two ranch wives following behind like confused soldiers retreating from unexpected defeat. The remaining people stared at Celia with a mixture of shock and admiration. Mrs. Thompson spoke into the silence. That was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. Probably both, Celia admitted, but I'm tired of pretending she has powers she doesn't actually possess. The meeting continued, but everyone knew something had shifted. The conflict between Celia and Eleanor was no longer social maneuvering. It was open warfare. That night, Celia went into early labor. The pain started around midnight, sharp, regular, undeniable. Orson sent for the doctor immediately, then paced the bedroom like a caged animal while Celia breathed through contractions. This is my fault, he said for the 10th time. You pushed yourself too hard because of me, because of defending us. Shut up, Orson, Celia said through gritted teeth. Babies come when they come. This isn't about fault. But privately, she wondered if the stress had triggered it. 8 months wasn't catastrophically early, but it wasn't full term either. If the baby had problems, if something went wrong because she'd been too stubborn to rest, the doctor arrived 2 hours later. He examined Celia quickly, then delivered news that made Orson go pale. The baby's breech. We need to turn it, or this will be extremely dangerous. What followed was hours of pain unlike anything Celia had experienced. The doctor's attempts to manually turn the baby, the pressure, the fear that something was seriously wrong. Orson held her hand through all of it, whispering encouragement while looking terrified. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the baby turned. The doctor's expression showed relief. All right, now we can proceed normally, but it's going to be a long night, Mrs. Hale. It was. Dawn was breaking when Elias Hale finally entered the world, small, underweight, but alive and screaming with impressive lung capacity. Celia held her son with shaking hands, tears streaming down her face as the doctor checked him over. He's small, the doctor said, probably because of the early arrival, but everything appears functional. Keep him warm, feed him frequently, watch for any breathing difficulties. He looked at Celia seriously. And you need complete bed rest for at least 2 weeks. No arguments, no ranch work, no Wednesday meetings. Your body needs to recover. Celia wanted to protest but didn't have the energy. She just nodded, holding Elias close, feeling his small warmth against her chest. Orson sat on the edge of the bed, looking at his son with an expression Celia had never seen before. Pure, undiluted wonder mixed with terror. He's so small, Orson whispered. He'll grow. What if something happens? What if... Then we'll handle it, same as we handle everything else. She looked at Orson, saw the fear in his eyes, and understood it completely. They'd spent months fighting social wars and drought and Eleanor Crowley's manipulations, but nothing had prepared them for this. The overwhelming vulnerability of holding a tiny life that depended entirely on them. We're going to be okay, Celia said, though she wasn't sure she believed it. Orson kissed her forehead, then gently touched Elias's impossibly small hand. The baby's fingers curled around his father's finger reflexively, and Orson made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "We're parents," he said. "We're parents." Outside, the drought continued. Eleanor Crowley was undoubtedly planning her next move. The valley still faced a brutal winter with scarce resources and uncertain futures. But in that moment, in that room, none of it mattered as much as the small weight in Celia's arms and the man beside her who'd fought the entire territory to build this family. They'd survived everything thrown at them so far. They'd survived this too. They had to. Because now they had someone depending on them too. The 2 weeks of forced bed rest nearly drove Celia insane. She lay in their bedroom listening to the ranch operate without her, hearing Tom Brewster's voice giving orders she would have given differently, knowing the Wednesday meetings had been suspended and families were struggling without guidance. Elias nursed every few hours, his small body warm against hers, and she felt torn between fierce protectiveness and frustrated helplessness. Orson tried to fill the gap, but he was managing ranch operations, handling the water committee, and attempting to care for a newborn he was terrified of breaking. By the end of the first week, he looked as exhausted as Celia felt. "You need help," Celia told him on the 8th day. "Real help, not just Tom managing the men." "I'm managing. You're drowning. I can see it." She shifted Elias to her other arm. "What about those families we took in? Mrs. Thompson used to run her own household. She could help with cooking, with Elias when I'm too tired to think straight. I'm not asking a woman we're already helping to do more work. You're not asking. I am. And it's not charity, it's trade. She helps here. I pay her a wage she can save toward rebuilding her homestead come spring." Orson looked at her with tired admiration. "Even flat on your back, you're solving problems." "Someone has to." Mrs. Thompson agreed immediately. She moved into one of the ranch house's spare rooms and took over cooking and household management with efficient competence. More importantly, she had 6 children of her own and knew exactly how to handle a fussy newborn when Celia was too exhausted to function. "He's small, but he's tough," Mrs. Thompson said one evening, rocking Elias while Celia tried to eat dinner. "My third was early like this. Screamed his way through the first 3 months, then turned into the healthiest of the lot." It was exactly the reassurance Celia needed. Not false comfort, but practical observation from someone who'd survived similar circumstances. By the end of 2 weeks, Celia was back on her feet, moving slower, tiring easier, but functional. The Wednesday meetings resumed in a modified format. Celia would sit in a comfortable chair with Elias sleeping nearby while people brought their questions and concerns. It wasn't the same as before, but it worked. What Celia didn't know was that Eleanor Crowley had spent those same 2 weeks preparing her final attack. It came on a gray December morning when Orson returned from town with a folded newspaper and an expression that made Celia's stomach drop. "What happened?" He handed her the paper without speaking. It was the Territorial Gazette, distributed to every settlement within 200 miles. The headline made her blood run cold. "Drought Crisis Mismanagement: How Amateur Leadership Threatens Wyoming Ranching." The article was devastating. It painted the water-sharing agreement as naive overreach by inexperienced organizers. It characterized Celia's Wednesday meetings as dangerous advice from an unqualified woman playing at authority. It included quotes from unnamed ranchers expressing concern about reckless decisions and deteriorating conditions under Hale influence. It even suggested that the early birth of Elias was evidence of Celia's poor judgment in refusing to rest appropriately. The byline was a territorial journalist, but the quotes were clearly from Eleanor Crowley or her allies. The damage was calculated and comprehensive. "Everyone will read this," Celia said quietly. "From here to Denver, every rancher, every businessman, every territorial official. It's lies. People know the truth." Do they? Or do they know what they've experienced locally while everyone else reads this and forms opinions based on Eleanor's version of events? She set down the paper carefully, hands shaking. "This isn't about the valley anymore. She's poisoning our reputation across the entire territory." Orson sat beside her, looking more defeated than she'd ever seen him. "I don't know how to fight this. Legal disputes I can handle. Social pressure I can ignore. But printed lies distributed to thousands of people? How do we counter that?" Celia had no answer. For the first time since this war began, she felt genuinely helpless. The article's effects were immediate. Within days, 2 ranchers who'd been cautiously supportive withdrew from the water sharing agreement. 3 families who'd relocated under the labor exchange program requested to leave, citing concerns about the Hale's unstable leadership. Even Jacob Morrison, who'd been their strongest ally, came to the ranch looking troubled. "I don't believe the article," he said without preamble. "But Orson, perception matters. And right now the perception is that you and Celia are in over your heads." "So what do you suggest?" Orson asked, frustration bleeding through his usual calm. "Prove them wrong. Demonstrate competence so clearly that the article looks ridiculous in comparison." Jacob paused. "But that requires time, and winter doesn't give us time. If this drought continues, if we hit January with the same water scarcity we're facing now—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. They all understood the mathematics of survival. Cattle needed water. Water was disappearing. Eventually, the equation stopped balancing. That night, Celia sat in the nursery holding Elias while he slept, trying to figure out what they'd missed. They'd done everything right. Organized cooperation, shared resources, helped struggling families, and still, Eleanor had found a way to turn their competence into evidence of incompetence through the simple act of controlling the narrative. "We can't win this way," she said aloud, though no one was there to hear. "We can't out-manipulate someone who's been manipulating people for decades." Elias stirred in her arms, made a small sound, settled again. Celia looked at her son's face, thought about the valley he'd grow up in, and felt something shift in her understanding. They'd been fighting Eleanor on Eleanor's terms: social warfare, reputation management, controlling perceptions. But that was Eleanor's expertise, not theirs. Their strength had always been practical competence, fixing problems, organizing solutions, getting things done. So maybe instead of fighting the article, they should focus on surviving the winter so completely that the article became irrelevant. She brought the idea to Orson the next morning. "We need to stop worrying about Eleanor's narrative and start focusing on actual survival, not just for us, but for everyone who's depending on the water agreement." "How? We're already doing everything we can. Are we? Or are we doing everything we know how to do with the resources we've tried?" She pulled out her calculations from the water committee meetings. "Look at these allocations. They're based on historical usage and current herd sizes. But what if we're thinking about this wrong? What if the problem isn't dividing scarce water? It's finding new sources?" "There are no new sources. Every creek, every spring, every aquifer in the territory is mapped. Every known one. But Wyoming territory is huge. There could be underground water we haven't found because we weren't looking hard enough." She met his eyes. "We need someone who specializes in finding water. A water engineer or geologist, someone with actual expertise. That costs money we don't have. Then we make the case to the Cattlemen's Association, pool resources to hire an expert. If we find new water, everyone benefits. If we don't, we're no worse off than we are now." Orson looked at her calculations, then at her face, and slowly started to smile. "Eleanor's trying to destroy us with words. You want to save us with water. I want to survive. The rest is just noise." The proposal to hire a water engineer met predictable resistance at the next Cattlemen's Association meeting. Martin Crowley called it a waste of money. 2 other ranchers suggested it was desperation masquerading as innovation. But Hayes listened carefully, then asked the question that mattered. "What's the alternative? We keep rationing water that's already inadequate, watch our herds deteriorate and hope for snow that might not come? Or we try something different?" The vote was close, but it passed. The association agreed to pool resources and hire a water engineer from Denver. It would take 2 weeks for the man to arrive, but hope, even cautious hope, was better than resignation. While they waited, the drought conditions worsened. December brought cold but almost no precipitation. The little snow that fell evaporated quickly. Water sources that had been slowly diminishing were now critically low. Several small ranchers gave up entirely, selling off their remaining stock at loss and leaving the territory. Celia watched these departures with a growing sense of dread. Every family that left represented failure, not because she or Orson had done anything wrong, but because sometimes hard work and good intentions weren't enough against nature's indifference. The water engineer arrived on a brutally cold morning in late December. His name was Robert Kiernan, a weathered man in his 50s who'd spent 30 years finding water in impossible places. He listened to their situation with minimal expression, reviewed Celia's documentation with increasing interest, then spent 3 days surveying the territory. On the 4th day, he called a meeting. "You've got an aquifer," he said without preamble. "Runs northeast to southwest, approximately 40 feet deep, substantially larger capacity than your current sources." The room erupted. Orson held up a hand for quiet. "Where exactly?" Kiernan spread a map across the table, pointed to an area straddling the boundary between 3 ranch properties, including the Hales land, Morrison's ranch, and ironically, the Crowley property. Access would require cooperation between all 3 ranches. "We'd need to sink a well here," he marked the spot, "and establish distribution infrastructure to reach all 3 properties plus any others willing to invest in the connection." "How much would this cost?" Martin Crowley asked, his skepticism clear. "Initial well and basic infrastructure? Around $2,000. More sophisticated distribution systems could run higher, but basic access shouldn't exceed that. $2,000. Split 3 ways, it was manageable. Split among more ranchers, even easier. But it required cooperation, trust, and the ability to work together despite months of social warfare. Everyone looked at everyone else, doing the same calculations. Hayes spoke first. "I'll contribute, whether I'm on the direct access or not. If this valley has water, we all benefit eventually." Jacob Morrison nodded. "Same. I'm in." One by one, ranchers committed funds. Even some of Eleanor's closest allies agreed because survival mattered more than social allegiance. The total contributions exceeded what was needed, which meant they could build better infrastructure than the minimum. The only holdout was Martin Crowley. "I need time to consider this," he said stiffly. "Consider fast," Kiernan replied. "Ground freezes much deeper and drilling becomes significantly more difficult and expensive. You've got maybe 3 weeks of viable drilling weather left." The meeting adjourned. Orson caught up with Martin outside. "This isn't about our family's feud," Orson said. "This is about survival. Your cattle need water same as mine." "I'm aware of my cattle's needs." "Then why hesitate? Your property sits right over the aquifer. You'd benefit as much as anyone." Martin turned on him, all pretense of civility dropping away. "Because every time I cooperate with you, Eleanor sees it as betrayal. Because she's been humiliated repeatedly by your wife's competence, and now I'm supposed to work alongside you to develop a water source that will make you look even more capable?" He laughed bitterly. "You have no idea what it's like living with that woman when she feels slighted." For the first time, Orson felt something almost like sympathy for Martin Crowley. "So you'd rather watch your ranch fail than upset your wife?" "I'd rather find a solution that doesn't require me to choose between my marriage and my livelihood." He walked away before Orson could respond. That evening, Orson told Celia about the conversation. She listened while nursing Elias, her expression thoughtful. "He's trapped," she said finally. "Eleanor's controlled him so long he can't see a way out. Probably convinced himself it's easier to follow her lead than fight her." "Sounds familiar." "Except you chose differently. You fought back." She looked at Orson seriously. "But Martin's not you. He's not strong enough or angry enough to break free. Which means Eleanor still has leverage through him." "What do we do?" "We give Martin a reason to choose survival over Eleanor's approval. And we give Eleanor a reason to stop fighting." "How?" Celia smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "We make her irrelevant." The plan was simple, but required perfect execution. While the other ranchers began organizing the well construction, Celia quietly reached out to every family that had attended her Wednesday meetings. Not asking for support or allegiance, just documenting their situations, their needs, their survival strategies. She compiled everything into a comprehensive report, not for the Territorial Gazette, but for the Territorial Governor's Office. A detailed account of drought conditions, cooperative solutions, families helped, and ongoing challenges. She included testimonials from a dozen ranchers and homesteaders. She attached her water-sharing calculations and Kiernan's aquifer survey. She made it clear, factual, and undeniable. Then she sent it to the governor with a simple cover letter. "Thought you should know what's actually happening in Wyoming Territory, since the newspapers seem more interested in gossip than facts." The response came 3 weeks later, just as drilling began on the new well. The governor's office released a statement commending the innovative cooperative approaches to drought management, and specifically mentioning both the water-sharing agreement and the aquifer development project. The statement was picked up by multiple newspapers, including the Territorial Gazette that had published Eleanor's attack article. Eleanor's narrative had been officially contradicted by the highest authority in the territory. The well took 2 months to complete. It was February when the first water flowed, cold and clean and abundant. The ranchers who'd contributed gathered to watch that first extraction, and even the most cynical among them couldn't hide their relief. Martin Crowley stood at the edge of the group, having finally contributed his share after the governor's statement made opposition politically untenable. He looked diminished somehow, like a man who'd fought a losing battle and knew it. Eleanor didn't attend. She hadn't been seen in public since the governor's commendation was published. That night, Orson and Celia sat on their porch, despite the cold, wrapped in blankets and watching their ranch settle into evening quiet. Elias slept inside, watched by Mrs. Thompson. The valley stretched out before them, snow-covered and harsh, but no longer dying. "We did it," Orson said quietly. "We survived. That's different from winning." "Is it?" "Eleanor's power is broken. The valley has water. The families that stayed are going to make it through winter. That looks like winning to me." Celia leaned against him, exhausted but oddly peaceful. "Maybe. Or maybe winning and surviving are the same thing, and we've just been calling it by different names." They sat in comfortable silence, breathing cold air and watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Somewhere in town, Eleanor Crowley was probably planning her next move, looking for some new angle of attack. But her power had been built on the ability to make people fear social exclusion more than they valued practical success. And that power only worked when people believed she controlled access to things that mattered. Water mattered. Survival mattered. Eleanor's approval, it turned out, did not. Spring came slowly to Wyoming territory that year. The drought broke in early March with 3 days of heavy rain that turned every creek into a torrent and filled the aquifer to levels that astonished even Kiernan. Grass began growing again. Cattle that had survived the winter on minimal rations started recovering weight. Families that had relocated began returning to their own properties with resources to rebuild. The valley started feeling like something other than a disaster slowly unfolding. Celia's Wednesday meetings had evolved into something more formal, a valley resource cooperative where families shared information, equipment, and labor. What had started as emergency drought management became an ongoing mutual aid network. Eleanor's friends stopped attending, but everyone else kept coming. In late April, something unexpected happened. Eleanor Crowley appeared at the Hale Ranch asking to speak with Celia. Mrs. Thompson answered the door, looked shocked, then came to find Celia in the office where she was updating resource allocation records. "Mrs. Crowley is here. Says she wants to talk to you." Celia's first instinct was to refuse, but curiosity won out. "Show her in." Eleanor entered the office looking smaller somehow. She'd always carried herself with such commanding presence, but today she just looked tired. They studied each other for a long moment before Eleanor spoke. "I came to apologize." Celia had prepared for many things. This wasn't one of them. "Go on. I spent months trying to destroy you because I couldn't accept that you were actually capable. That a woman from your background could be more effective than someone like me who'd spent decades managing this valley's social dynamics." Eleanor's voice was steady but strained. "I was wrong. About you, about your husband, about what actually matters in this territory. What changed your mind? Watching my own husband choose cooperation with you over loyalty to me. Watching families I'd tried to turn against you continue seeking your help. Watching the governor commend work I'd publicly criticized." She paused. "I've spent my entire adult life building influence, and you dismantled it in less than a year by actually helping people instead of controlling them." Celia could have been cruel. Could have pointed out every petty attack, every manipulation, every family Eleanor had hurt through her campaign. Instead, she asked a different question. "What do you want from me?" "I don't know. Permission to attend the resource cooperative meetings, maybe? A chance to contribute something useful instead of just wielding power for its own sake." Eleanor met her eyes directly. "Or at minimum, a truce. I'm tired of fighting, Celia, and I think you probably are too." It would have been so easy to refuse, to turn Eleanor away and savor the victory of watching her humiliation. But Celia had learned something important over the past year. Revenge felt satisfying in theory, but accomplished nothing in practice. Eleanor defeated, and bitter was still Eleanor, still capable of causing problems, still representing a camp of valley residents who'd followed her lead. Eleanor, humbled but cooperative, on the other hand, might actually be useful. You can attend the meetings, Celia said carefully. You can contribute ideas. But Eleanor, if you try to manipulate people or play social games, I'll call you out publicly and immediately. The cooperative works because people trust it. I won't let you destroy that trust. Understood. And one more thing. There are families you hurt during your campaign against us. Families who lost business, lost opportunities, suffered because they were associated with the Hales. You need to make that right. Eleanor flinched but nodded. How? Start with the Thompsons. Their homestead needs repairs they can't afford after relocating here all winter. Your husband's feed company overcharged them for years. Seems like restitution would be appropriate. I'll talk to Martin. Do that. Eleanor left without the commanding presence she'd entered with, but maybe that was the point. Power without humility had nearly destroyed the valley. Humility without power, on the other hand, might actually build something worthwhile. After she left, Mrs. Thompson came into the office with Elias, who'd just woken from his nap. The baby had grown significantly in 5 months, no longer the tiny fragile thing born too early. He had Orson's eyes and Celia's stubborn chin, and when he smiled, it transformed his whole face. Eleanor Crowley just apologized to you? Mrs. Thompson asked, disbelieving. She did. You think she meant it? I think she's smart enough to see when she's lost and adapt accordingly. Whether that's genuine remorse or pragmatic survival, I don't really care as long as the behavior changes. Mrs. Thompson laughed. You're a better woman than me. I'd have slammed the door in her face. I considered it, but spite doesn't rebuild the valley. Cooperation does. That evening, when Orson came in from checking the new well distribution lines, Celia told him about Eleanor's visit. His reaction was predictable skepticism. You can't trust her. I don't, but I can use her. She's got organizational skills and social connections. If she genuinely wants to contribute instead of control, that's valuable. And if she's playing some long game, then I'll handle it, same as I've handled everything else. She handed him Elias, who immediately grabbed his father's finger. But I'm choosing to believe people can change, Orson, because if they can't, if we're all locked into being whoever we were at our worst moments, then what's the point of fighting for anything better? Orson looked at his son, then at his wife, and felt something in his chest ease. They'd survived. More than survived. They'd fundamentally changed how the valley operated, replacing social hierarchy with practical cooperation. And if Eleanor Crowley could be part of that transformation instead of an obstacle to it, maybe that meant the change was real and lasting. 2 months later, something else unexpected happened. Celia discovered she was pregnant again. The timing was terrible. Elias was barely 7 months old. The ranch was still recovering from drought damage, and Celia had just taken on new responsibilities with the resource cooperative. But when she told Orson, his reaction was pure joy untainted by practical concerns. Another one? Apparently I'm very fertile. The doctor seemed surprised too. Orson picked her up and spun her around, which made Celia laugh despite her own complicated feelings about the news. When he set her down, his expression was so openly happy that her reservations dissolved. We're going to have 2 children, he said, like he couldn't quite believe it. We are, which means we need to expand the house, hire more help, and figure out how I manage cooperative meetings while handling 2 babies under 2 years old. We'll figure it out, same as we figure out everything else. This pregnancy was easier than the first. No social warfare, no drought crisis, just normal ranching challenges and the usual discomforts of carrying a child. Celia continued working but learned to delegate more, training 2 women from the cooperative to help manage the Wednesday meetings and resource distribution. In late spring, nearly a year after Eleanor's apology, something remarkable happened. Eleanor Crowley hosted a valley-wide gathering at her ranch, not a social function for the elite, but a practical meeting for everyone involved in the resource cooperative. She provided food, organized the agenda, and facilitated discussions without once trying to control the outcomes. Afterward, she approached Celia privately. Thank you, Eleanor said. For what? For giving me a second chance. For showing me that influence built on helping people lasts longer than influence built on controlling them. She paused. I'm not saying I've become someone different. I'm still proud, still concerned with status, still probably too controlling, but I'm learning, slowly. Celia studied the woman who'd once tried to destroy her marriage. her husband's business, and her reputation. She saw genuine change there, imperfect and incomplete, but real. "We're all learning," Celia said. "That's the point." In December, 3 weeks before her due date, Celia gave birth to June Hale, a daughter who came quickly, loudly, and with far less drama than her brother. Orson held his daughter with the same awestruck expression he'd worn holding Elias, and Celia watched her husband become someone she'd always suspected existed beneath the tough rancher exterior, a man capable of profound gentleness. The ranch house that had once felt too large and empty now felt full in the best possible way. Children's laughter, Mrs. Thompson's cooking smells, Tom Brewster stopping by to discuss business while simultaneously making faces at the babies. It was chaotic and exhausting and sometimes overwhelming, but it was also exactly what Celia had never let herself hope for during those years running a boarding house alone. On a warm evening in early spring, 4 years after that first meeting in Henderson's general store, Orson and Celia sat on their porch watching Elias chase chickens while June napped in Celia's arms. "You ever regret it?" Orson asked. "Marrying me, dealing with Eleanor, all the fights and stress?" Celia thought about it honestly. "I regret the pain we went through. I regret the families that suffered because of Eleanor's campaign. I regret that Elias was born early because I pushed myself too hard." She looked at Orson directly. "But I don't regret choosing you, not for a second. Even when things were worst? Especially then. Because the worst moments showed me who you really were. Not the powerful rancher everyone else saw, but the man willing to risk everything for what he believed in." She shifted June to a more comfortable position. "That's worth more than safety or social approval or any of the things I gave up to be here." Orson kissed her forehead, a gesture so familiar now it felt like breathing. "I love you." "I know. You tell me every day. Someone should. You saved this ranch, Celia. Not just financially, but fundamentally. You turned it from a business into a home, from isolated success into community leadership. Everything good here exists because you refuse to be anything less than yourself." She wanted to deflect the praise, point out his contributions, share the credit. But she'd learned over 4 years that accepting acknowledgement wasn't arrogance. It was honesty. She had changed things. She had saved things, and pretending otherwise helped no one. "We saved it," she said instead. "Together." The valley around them had changed too. The resource cooperative had expanded into a formal organization with elected leadership. Eleanor Crowley, currently serving as treasurer of all things. Water management had become sophisticated enough that drought, while still challenging, no longer threatened mass exodus. Small ranchers and homesteaders who'd barely survived that first winter were now thriving, their success built on cooperation rather than isolation. It wasn't perfect. There were still disputes, still families who struggled, still people who resented the Hales' influence or disagreed with cooperative decisions. But the valley had learned something important, that strength came from working together, not tearing each other down for failing to meet arbitrary standards. Elias ran back to the porch, breathless and laughing. "Mama, the chickens won't let me catch them." "That's because chickens are smarter than they look," Celia said, pulling him close with her free arm. "Maybe try being friends with them instead of chasing them." "Can chickens have friends?" "Everything can have friends if you approach them right." It was a simple answer to a child's question, but it contained the wisdom Celia had learned through years of fighting and surviving and ultimately thriving. You couldn't force people to accept you. You couldn't manipulate your way to genuine belonging, but you could be honest, be competent, be willing to help, and eventually people would see past their prejudices to the person you actually were. Sometimes that took months, sometimes years. Sometimes it never happened at all, and you had to accept that some battles couldn't be won through determination alone. But the battles worth fighting were never about changing other people. They were about refusing to let other people change you. As the sun dropped toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange, Orson put his arm around Celia's shoulders. June stirred in her sleep, making the small sounds newborns make. Elias leaned against his mother's leg, tired from chasing chickens and ready for dinner. A family, a home, a life built from nothing but stubbornness and love, and the radical decision to choose each other despite every obstacle. The valley spread out before them, green and alive and full of possibility. Somewhere down in town, people were living their lives without thinking about the Hales, except when they needed help or advice. Eleanor Crowley was probably planning next month's cooperative meeting. Tom Brewster was settling the ranch hands in for the evening. The world kept turning, problems kept arising, solutions kept being found. And through it all, two people who'd started as a rancher and a laundress sat together watching the sunset, content with what they'd built and unafraid of whatever came next. Because they'd learned the most important lesson the frontier could teach, that survival wasn't about being perfect or powerful or approved of by the right people. It was about choosing your partner carefully, fighting for what mattered, and refusing to surrender your dignity to make other people comfortable. Everything else was just details. "Come on," Celia said, standing carefully with June still in her arms. "Let's get dinner started before this one wakes up hungry." Orson took Elias's hand and they walked inside together, a family moving through the ordinary rhythms of an extraordinary life, built not through luck or privilege or social position, but through the simple, radical act of choosing love over fear. The ranch house door closed behind them. The sun continued setting. The valley settled into evening quiet. And somewhere in that house, a laundress who'd become a rancher's wife, and then something far more important, a woman who'd changed an entire territory by refusing to be anything less than herself, fed her children, kissed her husband, and prepared for tomorrow. Bipo. Because tomorrow would bring new challenges, new problems, new people needing help. And she'd face it the same way she'd faced everything else, with clear eyes, practical competence, and absolute refusal to apologize for existing. That was the real victory. Not defeating Eleanor Crowley or surviving the drought or winning social acceptance, but understanding that none of those things defined her worth. She defined it herself through her choices and actions and the life she built with her own hands. And that was something no one could ever take away.